markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. We've got green on the screen after new economic data showed resilient consumer demand. We're talking about retail sales. Yeah, they came in hotter than expected in March, and the prior month was also revised higher. We go to the housing market. U.S. home builder sentiment, that leveled off this month after a recent surge. Buyers just waiting for those rates to drop. That's according to the National Association of Home Builders. Right now, we have the S&P 500 up about 0.2% or 12 points. The Dow up 0.2% as well, up 102 points. And the NASDAQ, that is little change. That's up about 14 points. To commodities, we'll check in with Brent crude at $89 a barrel. We have NYMEX crude at $85 a barrel. Spot gold higher at $2,347 an ounce. What's moving the markets? Trump Media and Technology down nearly 16% right now. The company registered its shares for potential resale. And finally, this is for Alex, because I know you love the Barbie movie. Yes. Barbie Mania is not over. Mattel partnering with Kraft Heinz to produce a pink barbecue sauce, but it's only in the UK and Spain. Sorry.
That's weird, because I don't feel like Barbie had the same resonance not in the US. I feel like it was a very specific female age group in the US. Like when I talked to people in Europe, it like didn't like hit in the same way, right?
No.
Did you feel the same way?
No, I definitely here it's like all about the girl power.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like, I don't know, Spain with pink barbecue sauce, like I know. Aren't they all organic and fancy?
But it's not coming here.
It's not coming here. No. I would totally buy it, and then it would just sit in my cabinet and do nothing. And Paul's so into this right now.
Did we confirm whether John Tucker saw this?
He definitely has not seen it. Come on.
No, I'm waiting for the Barbie book to come out.
Did you at least watch the link I sent you of I'm Just Ken?
Yeah, I wanted a couple of minutes of it, and then...
A couple of minutes?
And then he turned it off.
No, that's not me. I'm the wrong demographic.
That guy. All right. Thanks, Lisa Mateo. All right, let's get to Tesla, because that stock is doing some interesting stuff today. So a couple pieces of news. One, you have the senior VP resigns. So that's Drew Baglino. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that the car maker slashing headcount by about 10%. So put those two things together, and what does that tell us about where Tesla is right now? So joining us is Steve Mann, Bloomberg Intelligence Global Autos and Industrial Research Analyst. This is a great example of why Bloomberg Intelligence Radio can bring you the best analyst from all of our guys all around the world, and Steve is definitely one of them. What has been your take over the last few hours on management shakeups as well as headcount at Tesla?
Well, it's actually worse than I thought. I thought, the first quarter sales drop was, hopefully close to the end, but, seems to be the light at the end of the tunnel is not really here yet. And it looks like, it's running, their plants are running just pretty much well below capacity at the moment. And there's still a lot of cost headwinds facing them. They're trying to balance a lot of things in terms of deliveries, production. They're raising prices. I don't know how long that's going to last. So execution is risk. Execution is key for the company in the next, 6 to 9 months.
So, Steve, where are we now, or where is the market when you talk to investors in terms of getting a sense of where EV demand is in the U.S. and then maybe globally?
Well, EV demand is waning. I think the interest rate is not helping. They're looking to, as you know, the Fed's probably not going to cut rates anytime soon in the next couple of months, next quarter or so. So that's going to continue to weigh on big purchases like automobiles. We're seeing that across the board in the U.S. as well as in China. China's a little bit worse for Tesla because there's so much new competition there. But sales is slowing for GM. Sales is slowing for Ford. Ford just had to cut production of their Lightning, recently announced about a couple of weeks ago. So I think this year will be tough for the industry. Now, we probably won't see any improvement until, as far as I'm concerned, 2026.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that pushes it way out. Here was interesting headline, too, Paul, to your point, is that Reuters is reporting that BP is cutting over 100 jobs in its electric vehicle charging unit. And we all talk about how we really need chargers to deal with the range anxiety. And now you have a big player here shutting some jobs in its EV charging unit. Steve, why 2026? Why is it going to take that long?
Yeah, I think what the market, the EV market is facing today is that we had early adopters, especially on the high end. They're pretty much tapped out. They can buy only so many. The market is relatively smaller than the mass market. I'm looking at 2026 because if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's bringing in onshoring a lot of the EV battery production in the U.S. Hopefully, it will cut costs. And at the same time, in 2026, we're looking at more affordable EVs coming into the market. That's going to expand the addressable market for EVs, and that's why we're thinking 2026 will probably be a better time for the EV market than it is today.
So, how about profitability in that scenario, Steve? It's tough to make an argument that these EVs can be profitably manufactured at a higher price point. How are they going to adjust their cost structure to be profitable at maybe a lower price point? I don't know, $30,000 or something like that.
That's a good question. I think if you look at the EV startups in the U.S., the only one that's really still profitable is Tesla. You saw Fisker being delisted. There's risk of them filing bankruptcy. Both Lucid and Rivian will need billions of dollars just to get them through the next couple of years. We're not sure if they're going to get that money given the slowdown in the EV market. But on the bright side, I think Tesla is still generating cash. They're making some of the cuts today, I think, really to maintain cash generation so they can continue to invest for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
For them, I think what's really important for them is the AI, the FSD, the full self-driving systems that they're trying to build out. That's going to be the future of the automotive industry. It's really those software-based subscriptions that's going to drive revenue, not so much of the automaking. So if they're trying to get there, trying to maintain cash, maintain some level of profitability to make those investments to get them there.
Interesting. I was thinking about self-driving as I was coming up the Taconic, going down the Taconic yesterday, and I was like, would I want to be in a self-driving car right now on the Taconic? I don't know the answer to that.
You were driving?
I was driving, and I was like, I don't know, man. I think I want to trust myself behind the wheel. Anyway, before we let you go, Steve, let's go to the SVP departing. So Drew Baglino, he leaving the company, as I mentioned, senior vice president. Who is he? Do we care? Like how big a deal he was in Tesla? What did he do? Walk us through it.
Yeah, we do care. He's I think he's also the face of Tesla. Looks like to be the right-hand person for Elon Musk. So it's a big loss for the company, no doubt about it. But he's a powertrain engineer for the most part, energy engineer. So he's really involved in the battery. If you saw him on Battery Day, I think if you look at Tesla and what Elon Musk have been saying about Tesla's future, which is on AI, which is on full self-driving. Is it a big loss? I mean, you can argue that, hey, Tesla is moving on to the next phase. It's not about building the motors, not about building the batteries. They've gone through that process over the past 15, 18 years. I think, looking forward, they probably need more people around, AI, development algorithms for the future of the car.
All right, Steve Mann, thanks so much for joining us. As always, Steve Mann, he covers the global auto industry for Bloomberg Intelligence based down there in Princeton, New Jersey. It's got to be tough, I think, to be like a Kathy Wood, to be so invested in this company, not only financially, but kind of reputationally, and to have that, to deal with a CEO like Elon Musk is so mercurial, I guess is maybe the right term. And one of the, the results of that is, executive turnover. And that's got to be really challenging for investors.
Yeah, but what's interesting with her view is that it's so long term that I wonder if these things become just blips to her. I don't know. Yep. On the other side of it.
Yeah, she's very obviously had great success with this disruption kind of theory, but boy, you got to ride with Elon Musk and his foibles.
It's true. Yeah, no, that'd be really hard. Would you do self-driving, by the way, in Jersey?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Absolutely
So we're on the same page with that one.
Well, let
This one
Tucker
makes
drive me
sense.
around. I trust him.
Well, that's his second job for sure.
Exactly.
Makes sense. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Earnings season continues with Goldman Sachs recording a 28% jump in net income in the first quarter, blowing past Wall Street expectations. Analysts were expecting a drop from a year ago. Bloomberg's Sonali Basak says it's tough to find a miss in this report.
Look at their return on equity, for example. They came in at nearly 15%. The market was expecting 11%. You look at fixed income trading, it more than doubled from the prior quarter, and it beat JP Morgan on equities, coming in above where Morgan Stanley is expected tomorrow. They not only beat their expectations, they set the bar higher in all those traditional investment banking businesses.
Now we have Goldman Sachs up about 3%. At Charles Schwab, first quarter net revenue topped estimates. Those shares are up about 3.5%. And M&T Bank is higher. They're up about 4%. Morgan Stanley, Bank of America wrap up big bank earnings tomorrow. Well, you have some deal-making news. Bloomberg's learned Salesforce targeting Informatica. Now the move would add its data integration and management capabilities. Salesforce down about 5%. And Apple shares are lower. They're down about 1% after its iPhone shipments. Well, they slid to worse than projected 10% in the March quarter. That was due to sales in China. And Tesla cutting 10% of its workforce, or about 14,000 staffers worldwide, after a slowdown demand. Meanwhile, sources tell Bloomberg its senior vice president Drew Baglino has left the company. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow has that.
This is separate from the layoffs. He's one of just 4 stated or listed executive officers, or he was, and has been at the company for more than 17 years, reported directly to Elon. We've also reported that Rohan Patel, who is basically the public policy chief at Tesla, has also left the company.
And we've got Tesla shares down 3%. That is your company news at this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. Happy Tax Day. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. We're live from Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. We give you all the top analysts that cover all the top companies around the world, 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. We also bring you world and national news. Here is John Tucker. John?
All right, thanks to Alex. Donald Trump's first criminal trial started in Manhattan this morning with the former president repeating his complaints. The hush money case is nothing but a political attack. After entering the courthouse on Center Street in Lower Manhattan, he paused before the cameras and said the case was an outrage and a persecution.
This case is nonsense. It should never have been brought. It doesn't deserve anything like this.
The 12 jurors who are picked will decide whether Trump falsified business records to conceal a hush money payment to a porn star before the 2016 election. And up in Boston, the 128th running of the Boston Marathon, featuring a full-scale return to Patriots Day tradition after the event shifted to a virtual format or limited attendance during the COVID era. Details from Bloomberg's Boston Bureau Chief Brooke Sutherland.
The Boston Marathon is one of the world's oldest, dating all the way back to the late 1890s, but more than 30,000 runners and their fans will be back in full force this year. The Chamber of Commerce is expecting a $200 million economic impact from the marathon, comparable to a Super Bowl. Hotel rooms are in short supply and restaurants are booking up. Many of the participants are also running to raise money for charities. Bank of America is now the race's primary sponsor, succeeding John Hancock. In Boston, I'm Brooke Sutherland for Bloomberg News.
Oh, and an update. Switzerland's Marcel Hug righted himself after crashing into a barrier when he took a turn too fast. As still, he coasted to a course record in the marathon today, winning the men's wheelchair race for the 7th time. Good for him. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas absent from court today with no explanation. The 75-year-old Thomas also wasn't taking part in remote arguments, as justices sometimes do when they're ill or other.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Iran and Israel and how to think about that going forward. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to check in with Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to get his thoughts on what is happening in Israel now that they are in direct conflict with Iran. Allison Williams is going to also join us. She's Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst covering all the global banks, to get her thoughts on Goldman Sachs. They put out some good numbers here today, getting back to their knitting. The stock is higher. We'll break it down with her. Plus, Ben Emmons will be in studio. He's a senior portfolio manager and head of fixed income at New Edge Wealth. We'll talk about the fixed income market with Ben. But first, let's kick things off with a Bloomberg Business Flash and Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. And here's what's going on. We have got the Dow. We've got the S&P. They are both higher right now. S&P well off session highs, still holding on to a 2-point gain on this Back to Work Monday, up less than 0.1%. Dow Industrials right now up 64. That is an advance of 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index in the red to start the week. Low of the day right now, down 19. That is a drop there of just about 0.1%. 10-year at 4.63%. We have got the 2-year 4.95%. Spot gold is trading higher, little changed, up 0.1%, 23.46 for an ounce of the precious metal, and a retreat now for crude, down 1.2%, 84.65 for a barrel of WTI. Federal Reserve Bank of New York President John Williams says the central bank will likely start lowering interest rates this year if inflation continues to gradually come down. He was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Radio.
I'm not fixated on where do rates need to go, over the next year. What I'm focused on is how do we best achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. The data we're seeing show that the economy is strong, and that's really good news, and labor market strong. At the same time, we are getting better balance, and we're seeing some decline overall in inflation.
Federal Reserve Bank of New York President John Williams speaking in an interview here on Bloomberg Radio with our Michael McKee. Goldman Sachs' back-to-basics approach is paying off as it posted profits that vaulted past expectations. Goldman Sachs shares, they are gaining now by 3.2%. We'll hear from Morgan Stanley tomorrow. Morgan Stanley up now by 0.9%. Recapping Mixed Monday here. NASDAQ trading lower. The S&P holding on to a 4-point gain, up now by less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top headlines and all the market analysis from our great analysts that cover everything worldwide. 2,000 companies in 130 industries. We are a live interactive broker studio right here in Midtown Manhattan, which apparently it's 75 degrees outside.
Yes, it is. It's like great spring day.
After
all the rain we've had for the month of March, we finally get some nice
Finally, at least for one day or two. You know who's loving this right now?
Oh, I know.
Kelly Lyons.
Yep.
Because I think last time it was terrible, it was raining and it was cold. But now Kelly Lyons is downtown in New York City courthouse as she is getting all the details on former President Trump's New York criminal trial that will really mark milestone in American politics. Kaylee, what's happening?
Well, it definitely is a milestone in American politics, Alex. This is the first time in history a former president of the United States is standing for criminal trial, and those proceedings are now underway. Of course, Trump is charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to alleged hush money payments paid to porn star Stormy Daniels in the days leading up to the 2016 election. The former president is currently sitting at the defense table in the courtroom on the 15th floor where they're dealing with a number of motions. The judge denied a motion for recusal that was brought by Trump. They also are considering whether or not to block entering certain things into evidence. A lot of those requests by the defense to block evidence related to alleged extramarital affairs that the former president had have been blocked by Judge Merchant, or he has refused to actually block that evidence. So they're getting kind of those loose ends all tied up, and then they'll begin the process of jury selection, in which they're going to have to do the pretty hard work of finding 12 jurors and 6 alternates that can be unbiased and fair in assessing this case, considering it is someone with high name recognition, not just here in New York, but nationwide, because this is a former president and current Republican presidential nominee, presumptively, that we're talking about.
And Kaylee, you mentioned he's sitting at the defense table on the 15th floor of the courthouse. Where he is not out on the campaign trail. What have we heard from Donald Trump or his campaign about how he's going to try to balance the requirements about being in court while running a presidential election campaign?
Well, Donald Trump contends, Paul, that this is all part of what he views as a weaponization of the Justice Department against him, and that he views cases like this, including to the 3 other criminal cases that have he's been indicted in, that is an attempt to keep him off the campaign trail, because legally as a criminal defendant, he is required to be here in person each day of this criminal trial. That said, Trump has shown in the past that he does have the ability to use courthouse appearances like this one to speak to the press, to address his base of supporters and really galvanize that support. He talked to reporters on his way in just today, talking about how this is political persecution in a case that never should have been brought in the first place. That said, though, this is not traditional campaign rallies and stops where he can visit the states that are likely to decide the election, like the key swing states. There's about 7 of them across the country that ultimately will prove critical into actually deciding the Electoral College. And of course, our polling with Morning Consult suggests that in those key swing states, more than half of voters say they would not vote for Trump if he is convicted of a crime. So at the end of the proceedings here, which could take 6 to 8 weeks, if he is a convicted felon, that could make him less likely to win the presidency come November.
All right, Kaylee, thank you so much for your reporting. We really appreciate it. Kaylee Lyons, co-host of Bloomberg's Balance of Power down in Lower Manhattan at the courthouse for former President Trump's trial, which is just getting underway. Looking at the markets here, we were substantially higher early at the open in the futures market, kind of flattish here right now. Let's check in with Abigail Doolittle, Bloomberg News markets reporter. Abigail, we've kind of given away some of those early morning gains here. What are you seeing?
We have, and we're now looking at a second down day for stocks. The S&P 500 earlier had been up about 0.8%. Now it's up just fractionally. The NASDAQ composite is actually down slightly. The NASDAQ 100 may soon follow. So what's working is NVIDIA, Eli Lilly, Amazon, of course, Goldman Sachs, you were just talking about, and some of the other banks. This is for the S&P 500, of course. And at the highs, it was actually up 0.9%. So we've really seen some intraday volatility of basically almost 2% on the day right now. Tesla, CRM, Salesforce.com down 6% on the news. The possibility that they might acquire another software company Informatica, that would be their third among one of their largest acquisitions, the largest since buying Slack a couple of years ago. Informatica itself is down more than 7%, so investors really saying they don't like this deal, or it could be the fact that both of those stocks are higher. In any case, that is the second biggest drag on the S&P 500. We also have Meta in the mix down. Apple, interestingly enough, it is coming off of its lows despite the iPhone news, which, you know, it's funny because a lot of it's not news at this point since we've been hearing so many reports of weakness. But of course, you were, Alex, last hour saying that IDC talking about phones delivering shipment down 10% year over year. So to put some more heft to it, you would think that investors would be selling that. But maybe it's, they're selling into that. It's going to be interesting, of course, to see what Apple does. But it's interesting now that Apple is off of its lows, the markets are closer to the lows. So it seems as though the broader markets and Apple are just continuing to diverge recently. And Apple actually right now trying to make it back above its 50-day moving average, doing the exact opposite of the markets.
So interestingly enough, do we know why markets started to roll over? I was looking through NI Heads, which is a great function on the terminal. You can just get up to speed headlines and they kind of scroll through. And I was looking at stuff that happened around 10 because that's when we saw that first leg lower. Nothing.
Yeah, I think that this is just a matter. First of all, there's not a lot of volume, so there's not a lot of conviction in terms of this selling. I think that you both know I don't like the term, despite the fact that I love charts. I don't like the term of it's technical selling, but I would say it's a continuation of the last couple of weeks, the bearish action that we've had. The last high for the S&P 500, I believe it was back in March. It was either the very first day of April or the end of March. For the NASDAQ 100, it's a little bit before that. So I would say just continued selling, but it also yields higher. I mean, you have that 2-year yield off of its highs, but it is still at a 495, that 10-year yield at a 463. So just, creates concerns around liquidity. Are we going to get the cuts from the Fed? Will it be 2? Will it be 3? Will it be none? When will they start? So I think some of that uncertainty around the Fed is something that investors and markets can weigh in on at any time.
All right, Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for joining us. Bloomberg's markets reporter Abigail Doolittle joining us here in our Bloomberg headquarters studio here. We're going to get back to geopolitics front and center yet again. Aaron David Miller joins us, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, joining us in Washington, D.C. via that thing called Zoom. All right, Aaron, talk to us about kind of how you view the Iranian response, the Israeli defense over the weekend here. Where do we go from here?
No, I think it's a story. Thanks for having me. Of what I would describe as the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, the good is easy. Israel's technical mastery of air defense, backstopped by the United States, its military aircraft and air defenses by the Europeans, the French and the Brits, and not surprisingly, but I think in an unprecedented fashion by key Arab states who participate in this Middle East air defense alignment of radars and intelligence, which is unprecedented. There's never been a Middle East war where at least the Israelis received that kind of support, including open support from the Jordanians who downed a number of drones. That's the good news. The bad and potentially ugly news is, number one, in a real war, and I think the Iranians actually telegraphed this and calculated and calibrated it so that they wouldn't prompt a massive Israeli response. In a real war, the Iranians would probably launch thousands of missiles and drones. That's number one. Number two, you have new rules established now. I mean, it was 33 years, it's been 33 years since any Arab state attacked Israel directly. That was Saddam Hussein in 91, who launched 43 Scud missiles. Then Prime Minister Shamir was persuaded by the first Bush administration not to respond. But you now have new rules between Iran and Israel, established in a rivalry that's strategic and for which there's no solution. So we're now forced to deal with the cruel realities that we're at best going to be managing this and trying to contain it. Mm-hmm. The Israelis have made it unmistakably clear, I think, that they intend to respond. The timing and the scale of that response, I think, is still very much up in the air. Maybe they'll look for a calibrated response that reinforces what has clearly been obvious, which is Israel's technical mastery and superiority over Iran. But there's no guarantee, of course, once you go up the escalatory ladder, Then Iran will respond, and then you raise the issue of Hezbollah. So that's kilometers away. That's not hours away. If Hezbollah launches missiles, it's not going to take hours to get to Israel, and they got a lot of them.
Aaron, this is a pretty grim picture that you're painting at this point. What are the chances that that's how it's going to play out? Or is there a real ability for President Biden to diffuse this?
Diffusing would mean meeting Iran's and Israel's core requirements. I'm not predicting regional war, which would lead to dramatic spike in oil prices and probably plunging financial markets and a degree of instability the Middle East has never experienced before. It's a matter of managing and containing. That's the question. Because there's no solution to deal with the reality that Iran is a nuclear weapons threshold state. There's no real solution to deal with Iran's proxies. That's always been a management issue, whether the Houthis are shelling international shipping, forcing shippers to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which is additional 3,500 miles, which raises rates and interferes with the global supply chain. There are no determinative, comprehensive answers to any of this. And if we need to complicate it even more, you have an Israeli-Hamas war, although the Israelis seem to have scaled down their ground campaign in Gaza, that carries so many uncertainties, including the fate of 134 hostages, 30 of whom the Israelis believe were either killed in captivity or died on October 7th, their bodies taken to Gaza to trade for Palestinian prisoners. So, I wish I could make you happy. But again, I'm not predicting we're going to a major regional war, but I guess my takeaway here is it's going to require a degree of restraint from Iran and Israel, and to a certain degree, some diplomacy from the Biden administration, particularly with Israelis.
Aaron, do we have any clearer picture today than we did on October 8th? What really the end goals are for Israel here? What would be a victory?
A victory, I guess, would be three things. Number one, Hamas would be, not as a political force, but as a military force, would be undermined and destroyed, so it would not be in a position to pull off another October 7th. Israel would kill the senior leadership responsible for the October 7th attacks and the redemption of the hostages. If those three things were accomplished, that would be, I think you could put that in the victory category. Although the price of victory is something that needs to be factored into this, particularly when it involves the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths and the humanitarian catastrophic starvation. Samantha Power, the aid administrator, even used the word several days ago, famine. So I'm not sure the Israelis can accomplish those three things. Right now, 6 months into the war, there's no indication. They have not killed the senior leadership. You've got a truly tragic situation with respect to hostages, particularly the women hostages. And you have a situation where Hamas, probably out of their 30,000 fighters, have at least 10,000 fighters that remain. So I think we're talking here again about a lot of uncertainties, and I just don't see a sort of determinative ending where Gaza becomes secure and stable, the Israelis and the Saudis normalize, and the Middle East remains or is converted into a happy conflict place where everybody's getting along with one another.
All right, Aaron, thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, is standing by. And then, thank you for joining us. I have to wonder then, as an investor, how do you, it just means we're going to be very sensitive to any kind of headline that's going to cross, which is maybe what we're seeing in the market sort of right now. And it's going to make the overall data that we see, I wonder how much more relevant that's going to be when these headlines can be very effective.
Yeah, it seems like, just to date, the market has kind of powered through all of this Middle East tension, much as it has the European geo-conflict in Ukraine seems to just generally bypass it and focusing on, maybe a little bit more local issues, i.e. central bank policy, corporate earnings. So maybe a day-to-day basis, there might be some volatility from this. But if you look at this market really since October, which was, kind of the low of this market, S&P up about 25% during that time here. So despite all the geopolitical tensions around the world, much, much hotter than I think anybody would like to see, this market is moving higher. And again, right today, we got pretty much unchanged on the S&P 500, the Dow up about 84 points here. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Another thing that startups need to look for is a market that is either started to undergo or is soon going to undergo exponential growth. I think this is actually related to one of the biggest mistakes investors make when evaluating startups. Investors always say, well, what's your growth rate? We care about the growth rate. Investors will forgive smallish revenue today if it's growing quickly. For some reason, people don't think about markets this way. But if you think about the most important startups, they are the ones that I start in small markets that are growing very, very quickly. 11 years ago, the market for iPhone apps was $0. It's now huge. And I think if you only think about the TAM today, you'll make a big mistake. What you really want to do is identify a market that's going to grow every year and be able to ride that up elevator.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to build a path towards that. Almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level up your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do three things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
The 1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio, and we are live from Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. You can also check us on YouTube. We love looking at earnings, and we love then going to our Bloomberg Intelligence crew. They have lots of experience in the field as Wall Street analysts, and they come here and they bring us all that experience and breadth of data, which sets me up for Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs is trading up by about 3%. The great headline here on the Bloomberg terminal is, back to basics. That's working. Who would have thunk? Allison Williams is a senior U.S. banks analyst for actually global banks and asset managers. She covers all of these names, and she joins us now. Allison, did the numbers surprise you here? I mean, a 28% jump in net income for the first quarter?
Certainly the strength did surprise me. We have been saying that we expect trading to be relatively resilient against a strong years ago, and we did expect to see some good fee growth, but certainly Goldman Sachs topping those estimates and topping some of the results that we saw on Friday from JP Morgan and Citigroup as well. And it's important to note that last year was really a cleanup year for this bank, really pulling back from some of the prior initiatives to expand into other types of businesses, really going back to the basics and what they do well on the institutional side of things, and really came through this quarter in terms of very strong revenue growth across the verticals. M&A also a key surprise for Goldman Sachs. We actually saw misses at JP Morgan and Citi and declines. We've seen an improving calendar in terms of announcements, but Goldman also executing on those completed fees, and that's important to them because they're the leader in that business. And so in addition to the good revenue side, we really saw that cost control coming through. The bank really made some efforts last year to reduce their cost base. They also had huge commercial real estate impairments last year, now have significantly marked down that portfolio, and so the cost ratio benefiting from both of those efforts this quarter.
Allison, what's Goldman Sachs saying about deal flow, both in terms of new issue market as well as advisory work?
So that's a little disappointing that they said the backlog is down from the end of the year. Part of that is I'm sure due to a lot of the executions that are coming through. And so I think that is an area that's yet to be seen how that will play out. The debt issue calendar was very strong on the investment grade side of things. For Goldman Sachs, it was really that leveraged loan issuance volume that was very helpful for them, just given their mix. So we're not sure that that's necessarily sustainable at the same pace that we saw throughout the year. IPOs, as you know, we've seen some uptick. We've seen some better performance this year, but we are still so far below, the banner year that we had in 2021. And so that's an area that I think we need a little bit more convincing in terms of the uptrend. I mean, keep in mind, we are going to see an increase. It's just that there's so much more room to run, if you will. M&A is an area where we're a little bit more optimistic. We have some of the boutiques coming through. I know you're familiar with those names, both of you, and Neil Sipes, my colleague, who really focuses on them. A little bit more optimistic outlook for some of those companies.
What does this mean for Morgan Stanley tomorrow?
So definitely raising the bar. As you pointed out earlier today, Alex, Morgan Stanley has the return of Ted Pick, and Ted Pick really built that business for Morgan Stanley, both on the fixed income and the equity trading side. Now he's at the helm. And they've really ceded that top equities position to Goldman Sachs in the last couple of years. So we're going to see, what kind of upside Morgan Stanley can produce. We've seen sort of flat to modest growth at JP Morgan, Citi, Wells Fargo. We did see a little bit better strength at Jefferies, who's a little smaller, has a little bit of a different fiscal quarter. But, how is Morgan Stanley's quarter going to shape up? And will they sort of get back to more of a focus on the trading business with Ted Pick at the helm?
Allison, now that the Goldman has pulled back from the majority of its foray into consumer banking, what do you think is next strategically for this bank? Do you think they have any other, big areas to maybe allocate capital to, or as the Bloomberg reporting says, maybe just stick to the knitting for a while?
I think, it is a capital allocation story in terms of going back to this institutional business. But, Paul, we are going to see another strategy playing out over time, which is they're freeing up capital in their asset management unit by taking some of the expertise that you and I know they've long held in terms of investing for themselves. And now they're applying that expertise to funds and really executing on the private market side of things. So as they continue to sell off some of those investments from their balance sheet, raise third-party capital, and really run funds for clients, they're going to continue to free up capital from the asset management business and then deploy that into the institutional business. One of the big areas for them in trading has been the financing business, both FICC financing and on the equity side of things. And so we think that is definitely a trend that's going to continue.
Do we know why they cut the Marcus rate yet by 10 basis points? Let's get to the question that everyone really wants to know about.
Yes, Alex is still annoyed.
I'm still harping at this, 100%.
Because, and it really goes to all the conversations that we have about deposits, right? There's the market impact, and then there's the competitive impact. And for most of the banks that we see that have no loan growth and want to, they have no loan growth, but they have had good growth in deposits. We've seen the loans reprice, and we're worried about sort of the competitive pricing on the deposit side. For Goldman Sachs, because they're pulling back from some of these businesses, right? So they're pulling back from the consumer initiatives as well as the card businesses. They have less needs for some of these deposits, and so that could be a factor in terms of the competitiveness and how competitive they want to be on deposits.
Were you here, Paul, when I was complaining about the Marcus thing?
Oh, yes.
Oh, he was here, even though he missed Friday. Okay, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Yes.
They cut their savings rate on their high-yield savings account by 10 basis points.
And that's the number one thing that we need to focus on.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we got that out for no reason. Okay, anyway, go ahead.
All right, Allison, in the next, I guess, week or two, we'll start also hearing from the European banks. Just broadly speaking, are the European banks, they're not even global banks anymore, are they?
I think it's really shifting, Paul, in terms of the competitors that we're watching, right? So, back in our days, Barclays with its acquisition of Lehman Brothers, they were a long competitor. Deutsche Bank at one point had these global ambitions. They've definitely scaled back. Credit Suisse is now part of UBS. But we look at someone like BNP, and that is really, I think, someone to watch, that they again, more focused on the European side. They have their own strength in terms of derivatives, but perhaps one of the up-and-comers around Europe. But from a market share perspective, the U.S. banks really have benefited since the global financial crisis as the European banks. First, it was a big pullback in FICC. More recently, it's been a pullback in the equity prime brokerage business. And then we do still hear these announcements. So SocGen, we hear pulling back a little bit in certain areas, Barclays as well. But then we start to hear rumblings about HSBC, and we've seen some hires of talent there. So I think there's always banks looking to come in and compete, but it might just be a matter of shifting landscape across the different competitors.
All right, Allison, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Allison Williams, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst for Global Banks and Asset Managers. She's really just the best.
Yeah,
she's so amazing.
Yeah.
Like, big heavy hitter there.
Who hired her?
Some guy named Paul, I think. That was Paul Sweeney, that
Yeah,
guy?
because she was at Morgan Stanley Investment Management, the asset management part of Morgan Stanley's senior position there. And, of course, Morgan Stanley owned, big shareholder in all the big banks. So she had, great access to senior management. She really understands the global banking business, which is good because there's been so much going on over the last 15 years.
And also, what are these global banks going to become?
Yeah.
Right? Like the regionals are one thing, but what are the global banks
Well, it's
going
funny.
to be?
You can't really do a cross-border M&A in the banks, so you can't get Barclays buying Deutsche Bank or something like that to create a real global player. So they've ceded that global financial services business to the U.S. banks. So it's really been interesting to watch, but I think it's short-sighted, but there they go. So again, we'll hear from Deutsche Bank and Barclays and all that kind of stuff in the upcoming weeks. S&P 500 up 10 points. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. All right, folks. Bloomberg is now in your dashboard with Apple CarPlay and Apple Android Auto. But right now, let's go to John Tucker for world and national news. John Tucker, what do you have for us?
All right, Donald Trump is at the New York courthouse where his first criminal trial is set to get underway. The former president taken to the building in Lower Manhattan from Trump Tower amid tight security as news helicopters circle the area. And Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is outside the courthouse in Manhattan.
He repeated lines that we have often heard from the former president in regard to the many legal cases he is facing. This, of course, just being one of 4 criminal indictments he has faced. On his way into the courthouse, he spoke with reporters saying this is an outrage. This is a political persecution. It's a case that never should have been brought. Of course, this case was brought by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who has charged him with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to alleged hush money payments paid to porn star Stormy Daniels in the days ahead of the 2016 election. Trump has pleaded not guilty to all of these charges.
That's Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons. A White House National Security spokesman John Kirby says it was an allied effort that managed to mostly foil that unprecedented attack by Iran on Israel over the weekend.
Ballistic missile destroyers in the Eastern Med helping shoot down ballistic missiles, fighter aircraft in the air, other partners participating. There was a lot of tools in the toolbox, and that there's no question that Iran recognizes the coalition that was put together to help Israel defend itself.
Kirby spoke on Bloomberg television and radio this morning. 11 people standing outside a family gathering Saturday night in what Chicago police was gang-related violence. They were shot on the city's south side. 4 victims were children. An 8-year-old girl fatally shot, a 1-year-old boy and an 8-year-old boy each were shot multiple times. They're listed in critical condition. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. I'm Charlie Pellet. We check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the green. Russell 2000, though, trading lower. That index of small cap shares down by 0.5%. But the S&P now higher by 13, up 0.3%. Dow Industrials up 138 now, up 0.4%. While the NASDAQ Composite Index up by just about 0.1%. Bonds sold off as solid retail sales spurred bets the Federal Reserve will be in no rush to cut rates, with traders also getting ready for a flurry of bank debt sales. The 10-year now at 4.64%, with a 2-year 4.95%. Spot gold up $5.50 the ounce to $23.50, up by about 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.3%, $84.56 for a barrel of WTI. There is fresh data on home builder sentiment. It leveled off, and with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Giudice.
The National Association of Home Builders Confidence Index is holding steady. That could mean buyers are waiting for lower mortgage rates. Data on anticipated home sales over the next 6 months fell for the first time since November. Just the same, the largest U.S. home builders have reported robust orders. Looking ahead, the government reports on March housing starts Tuesday, and economists foresee moderation. Vinny Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Goldman Sachs shares after earnings up 3.7%. Its back to basics approach is paying off as it posted profits that vaulted past expectations. Again, Goldman up by 3.7%. Morgan Stanley reports tomorrow up 1.7%. Charles Schwab shares after earnings up by 4.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us there. Let's get to Ben Emmons, Senior Portfolio Manager and Head of Fixed Income, New Age Wealth. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Ben, a million ways to go here, but let's start with some of the economic data we got today. Some retail sales came in really strong here. The consumer seems to be in pretty good shape, I guess.
It still is, Paul. I think that the employment reports are start to have an effect here, because this was actually the numbers that were weak in January, February, as we talked about earlier. And if I look through these reports, and you're seeing, basically items that are going to be feeding directly into GDP that were up, as well as those non-store sales. So I think what the market is doing today is to say, GDP is once again accelerating. This brings us actually back to the summer of last year when we had a similar phase of having higher bond yields, started indicating that we're having a stronger economy. And this report then confirms it. So I think it's this just shows once again, we just cannot be knocked off course here no matter what gasoline prices are doing. Gasoline sales are up too.
I mean, I'm looking at the 10-year. I mean, rates are higher. Alex and I have been talking about this all day. Rates are up another 12 basis points on the 10-year to 4.65% here. The 2-year, we're on a 5% watch here. So the bond market's telling you, I don't know, rates are higher for longer, I guess.
Higher for longer, and if this continues, then the 10-year is going to drift towards where the Fed funds rate is. Maybe not exactly, but not too far off. That would, I think, be a really interesting moment for markets, because that means that if you're getting a 10-year and a Fed funds rate about equal, should put a lot of pressure on the economy. So, but I think for now, and this is our view, that we're going to probably move into this 4.75 to 5% zone. If this type of data shows that GDP is going to be upgraded and the PCE is going to be higher, we're going to have to expect that yields are going to continue to reflect better growth on top of the supply that we're going to continue to have. Right? It was very substantial treasury supply.
So Ben, that definitely means a buy a tech thing, because they have the growth, they have the cash flow. They're not going to be subject to any of the refinancing, et cetera. But I'm wondering if this scenario just dents the rotation that we've seen, right? This, I'm sure, is bad for small caps. What does it do to the cyclical space?
Yeah, you could think of that anything interest rate sensitive, as in the small cap space, typically underperforms. We're of the view, though, that we think the rotation, the financials, energy rotation has really happened, that not so much derailed here. One, it shows today with Goldman Sachs it's just good trading environment. The energy market's obviously in play because of the geopolitics. So I think that part of the rotation we think is working. But you're right about tech. Like you gotta let your winners ride, as Cameron said too. Like we really have to not trade them, but basically invest in them and stay with them, because that is where it's happening in the economy. I think this is partly an impact too, once again, from all the infrastructure spending that starts to show up in the economy, making it each time stronger, right? So why we're getting so much strength with unemployment, and then it feeds through spending. So I think, concluding, tech remains in play here, even though the 10-year yield may go to 5%.
So, I mean, well, you're head of fixed income, so let me ask you. I can sit in a 2-year treasury at 4.95%. Should I do that, or should I go out on the credit curve a little bit and maybe look at some corporate bonds, whether it's an investment grade or high yield? How are you guys positioning?
So I put a little note out on Friday for New Edge. I was sort of coming to the point of looking at the very short end of the yield curve, where anything that's floating rate, investment grade or treasuries, or even somewhat to extent high yield, is just performing like so incredibly stable, because you're getting all this interest, right? So the spread of floating rate bonds over the treasury are anywhere between 200 and 300 basis points, depending which area you're in. That's pretty attractive. You keep collecting that interest. And if you think about what's going on with the 10-year yields, so on Friday we rally a lot on geopolitics. We come in today, we have a completely opposite picture. That's a lot of volatility. So I think from our point of view, you want to be a little bit more positioned there on the shorter end of the yield curve, because the yield curve is not going to normalize much as the Fed's on hold. You collect all that interest and give you very stable performance, and sort of wait it out until we get higher yields in the low end, that at some point is going to start slowing down the economy. We do think, though, that the buy zone for the 10-year will probably be in that 4 to 4.75-5% range. I would think that a lot of people will start looking at it and buying. We probably too.
Do you think we get to 5% on the 10-year?
I think it's fairly likely, and that's not just because of just today's number, but one thing with bonds currently is that if you look at term premium, as we call it, a little like wonky term, but if you take what's expected from the Fed for the next couple of years and where inflation is, and you take that out of the 10-year, there's almost no yield there. There's very little compensation. And if I then judge the way this geopolitical event is played out against an economy that doesn't get thrown off course and stays above trend, the volatility of bonds, long-end bonds, will stay higher and should likely drive it a little bit up towards that 5%. Lastly, this refunding announcement that we're going to get, I believe is on April 29th, there was something really interesting, Alex, about the TBAC, the advisory committee, that put a presentation out a few weeks ago. They actually made a forecast that T-bill supply should decline, but the long-end supply should stay the same. If the Treasury follows through on that advice, that should be refracted into the yield curve, and that isn't right now, not enough, I think, because of that low term premium. So I think for all these reasons, throwing the Fed to that the Fed's cuts going to be more and more priced out, you're going to get to 5%. If you believe the technical analysis from pre-financial crisis up until now, you look at retracements, you could go even as high as 5.3, which is where the Fed funds rate is. That would be pretty extreme, I think, and it would be a real buying opportunity. We think the zone comes into 4.75, 5%.
So the Fed, what's your call for 2024? Will they cut in 2024?
So I was listening to Williams today, who had with Mike McKee, a good interview. He still stays very confident that they can do it. But he's important to listen to, because he's actually the person that put out the framework on how they want to do it. Meaning, if inflation continues to get on track down to 2%, even though it's slower now, that Fed funds rate that's restrictive can be at some point cut down to take the restriction out. He thinks that they're still on course with that. I do think, though, the markets are probably more rational now about earlier this year and saying, yeah, that was not 7 cuts. That's probably 1 to 2 cuts. The window is obviously narrowed a lot, right? Because as much as Powell said in the interview, I think it was also with Mike McKee or anyone else, said that the election didn't matter for them to make this rate decision. I thought it was interesting. Probably they are going to keep that in mind, right? So the window.
I'm giving Ben a look of like,
yeah.
All right, Ben Emmons.
Yep.
You go.
Yeah, Ben, thanks so much for joining us. Ben Emmons, Senior Portfolio Manager, Head of Fixed Income at New Edge Wealth, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Again, rates are higher yet again today, a little bit more on the longer term, a little bit of a reverse on that inversion. We've got the 2-year up 5 basis points, 4.95 on your 2-year Treasury. The 10-year Treasury is up 12 basis points, 4.64% there, so I guess I'm not refinancing the mortgage.
No,
just yet.
sorry, buddy.
This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Shares of former President Donald Trump's social media startup are plunging today after the company registered its shares for a potential resale. Shares of DJT, that is the ticker, down now by 15%. Trump Media and Technology Group, the parent of Truth Social, filed to register shares, including those held by insiders and linked to warrants. The move is the first step toward opening the door for Trump and other insiders to get approval from the company's board to begin capitalizing on their stakes. Again, shares right now, they're down by 15%. Job cuts at Tesla. Elon Musk says Tesla will slash global headcount by more than 10% as the car maker grapples with a slowdown in electric vehicle demand. According to a memo seen by Bloomberg, the CEO cited duplication of roles and the need to reduce costs as the reason for the cuts. Goldman Sachs' back-to-basics approach is paying off as it posted profits that vaulted past expectations. The Wall Street giant recorded a 28% jump in net income in the first quarter, even as analysts brace for a drop from a year ago. More on the quarter from Bloomberg's Shanali Basak.
They are beating on many fronts here. The traders, the investment bankers, advisory revenue alone came in above $1 billion. Fixed income financing also hit a record, as well as equities having its best quarter, second best quarter on record for equities financing, helping traders really beat the mark here.
Bloomberg Shanali Bassett. Goldman shares, they're up now by 4%. Morgan Stanley reports tomorrow, also out this morning. Charles Schwab, its shares up now by 4.2%. First quarter net revenue topped estimates. And those are some of the top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. Happy Tax Day. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. We're live from Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. You are listening to Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top analysis with our top analysts worldwide. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries. We also love to bring you world and national news. And for that, we go to John Tucker. John.
All right, Alex, thanks a lot. Donald Trump's first criminal trial starting in Manhattan this morning with the judge allowing jurors to hear evidence about the former president's alleged extramarital affairs. Right now, they continue arguing over evidence as well as testimony. In the meantime, the pool of prospective jurors will be asked some wide-ranging questions. Let's get more on that part of the story from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
New York Supreme Court Justice Juan Merchan is describing the jury questionnaire as broad and exhaustive. It consists of 42 numbered questions, many of which contain multiple sub-questions. And this includes whether they ever attended a rally or campaign event for Trump, whether they're a supporter or member of the QAnon movement, the Proud Boys, or other similar groups, and where they get their news from. Notably, though, they will not be asked if they like Trump, a question that the judge says is irrelevant because it does not go to the issue of the prospective jurors' qualifications. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
And after Iran's weekend attack, Norman Rule with the Center for Strategic and International Studies says it is now a new Middle East.
It's a Middle East in which Israel every day must wonder if some action might provoke an Iranian missile attack or drone attack on Israel's territory direct. And it also is a new Middle East in which Israel is now, in theory, open to do the same against Iran. The United States, Europe, the United Nations, and others will certainly not want this to happen, but by allowing Iran to conduct an unprecedented attack, which was certainly not just symbolic, you now have this new world.
That's Norman Rule with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was a guest on Bloomberg Surveillance. Hear the full conversation on the Surveillance podcast. The Union for American Airlines Group pilots warning members to be vigilant amid what they call a significant spike in safety and maintenance-related problems at the carrier. The Allied Pilots Association cited problematic trends in a memo, including instances of tools being left in airplane wheel wells. And an update on the Boston Marathon. We have a winner, Sise Lema of Ethiopia, winning the marathon in what is being called a blistering pace, finishing in the unofficial time of 2 hours, 6 minutes, and 17 seconds. And also congratulations to him for having a name I can pronounce. And we check the markets and all that other stuff, news all
What's
day
a John
long.
Tucker personal best for the New York Marathon?
Wow. I have watched the marathon.
I maybe could run a mile or I don't know. My knees, my lower back, it doesn't work.
I do a 5K in 28 minutes, or at least I did in high school. I'm sure that
I was like, wait, that doesn't sound so bad. That sounds actually really good.
It was pretty good.
5K, 28 minutes.
So we'll see you at the Spring Lake 5K on Memorial Day weekend?
Yeah, I'll be there. I won't be running.
Okay.
But we'll be there. So I just want to go more on that story you said about American airline pilots, though. So just to recap, the Union for American Airlines Group pilots warn that they have to be vigilant amid a, quote, significant spike in safety and maintenance-related problems at the carrier. What? The union represents about 15,000 pilots, implored its members to avoid rushing while doing their jobs and to not be pressured into doing anything unsafe. I don't like that. I don't like that.
Well, in addition to, in this memo that was sent out, April 13th, they cited, as I said, the instances of tools being left in wheel wells. They also cite an increasing number of collisions between aircraft while they're being towed. Which
feels
is never
like
a good
something
thing.
we can definitely avoid. But also the idea that pressure, hurry up and get in the air. I mean,
Here's what I have noticed. This is my observation from flying this weekend, that the flight attendants continuously throughout the flight come down the aisle with their garbage bags. And so I think that's so they can turn around the plane a lot faster when they go.
all for it.
And so, I mean,
but let's not leave the tools in the
that's not
wheels in order to do that.
Let's tighten those screws and bolts when we want to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So,
Happy tax day. Happy Monday.
Yep,
You
absolutely.
made it. All right, Balance of Power is up next with Joe Matthew. That wraps it up for me and Paul on Bloomberg Intelligence. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The stakes are just getting higher. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the first criminal trial of a former president of the United States gets underway, following a weekend that saw Iran attack Israel directly. And now lawmakers in Washington preparing to vote this week on emergency funding. We're going to walk through all of this with a lot to cover today, and the help of Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons, who is at the courthouse in New York for us today. Bloomberg Pentagon reporter Tony Capaccio with us here in the Capitol. Insights and analysis as well from Alex Vatanka, who's director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. And of course, our signature panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, all together here in the first hour of Balance of Power. And we begin as ever on Wall Street. Let's get up to date on trading this Monday with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Happy Monday. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now. NASDAQ 100 index up as well. However, the Russell 2000 in the red, lower a little change right now, down 0.3%. We've got the S&P up 17. That is a gain of 0.3%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 162, up 0.4%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is up 21, a gain there of 0.1%. 10-year at 4.63%. We've got the 2-year yielding 4.94%. Gold right now up $6 the ounce to $23.50, up by about 0.2%. And a retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude falling today back below $85 a barrel, 84.43 right now, down 1.4%. Federal Reserve Bank of New York President John Williams says the central bank will likely start lowering interest rates this year if inflation continues to gradually come down. Williams was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Radio.
The National Association of Home Builders Confidence Index is holding steady. That could mean buyers are waiting for lower mortgage rates. Data on anticipated home sales over the next 6 months fell for the first time since November. Just the same, the largest U.S. home builders have reported robust orders. Looking ahead, the government reports on March housing starts Tuesday, and economists foresee moderation. Vinny Dowd, Judice, Bloomberg Radio.
And again, the 10-year 4.63%, the 2-year 4.94%. Gold, as mentioned, up by 0.2%. Goldman Sachs back to basics approach is paying off as it posted profits that vaulted past expectations. Goldman Sachs shares today, they are trading higher. Goldman up now by 3.65%. Tomorrow we will be hearing from Morgan Stanley. In the meantime, Schwab also reported this morning. Shares of Schwab up now by 4.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Bloomberg's Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now by searching Bloomberg Global News. You'll find our live stream there. And happy Patriots Day, specifically to those of you who are joining us in Massachusetts, in the Boston area. Happy Marathon Monday. If you're pulling us in on 106.1, we see you. Welcome to spring. I hope it's a great day. As we turn to history, throughout the course of this hour, from Washington to New York to the Middle East, this was an incredible weekend. And the events continue to unfold today, thanks to my partner, Kaylee Lyons, joining us from New York. She's made tracks to the courthouse, as I learned today. It's a part, not a room. Part 59 is the location on the 15th floor of the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse, and Kaylee is just outside, where Donald Trump is, of course, now beginning a criminal trial here, and jury selection is what starts us off. It's got to be a circus out there, Kaylee. He's apparently staying in town now for the next 6 weeks as the former president attends his own trial. How's it going?
Yeah, well, of course, Donald Trump is legally required to be here in person as a criminal defendant, and certainly it's buzzing here in Lower Manhattan. There was just a truck with Trump flags that passed by, blaring what appeared to be rap music with lyrics to include Donald Trump's name. As you say, Joe, it is really jury selection that is going to kick off these proceedings. He, of course, is charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to alleged hush money payments paid to porn star Stormy Daniels in the days ahead of the 2016 election. He denies those charges. He has pleaded not guilty, and he and his defense team have also filed a series of motions, and that is what they actually had to deal with first today. Judge Juan Merchan denying a motion of recusal, also denying the attempts by the defense to block a number of things being entered into evidence related to Trump's alleged extramarital affairs. A lot of those things will indeed be heard by the jury once that jury is selected. We still haven't gotten to the process of weeding out the more than 500 jurors that are waiting to answer the questionnaire, which will include things like, do you have a True Social account? Have you ever attended a Trump rally? They're going to find 12 individuals and 6 alternates who can be impartial and unbiased in assessing this case, which of course doesn't just involve a former U.S. president, but an active, presumptive Republican presidential nominee.
Well, that's absolutely right, Kaylee. We understand of the 42 questions and sub-questions that these prospective jurors will be asked, they do not include whether you are a Democrat or a Republican. Is that right?
Yeah, they also don't include what their feeling is about Donald Trump, because the judge argues that that shouldn't matter. It doesn't factor in to their qualifications. Of course, Donald Trump has made suggestions that it will be very difficult to find a fair jury here in Manhattan, where of course he is well known. And I would point out he did speak to reporters before entering the courtroom today, talking about how he views this case as political persecution. He said it's an assault on America, a lot of the same kind of ideas that we have heard from the former president before, and keeping in consistency with the pattern we have seen from him, which is using courtroom appearances as a way to actually have spontaneous campaign events, to not just address the press, but address all of those Americans who may decide to or to not turn out and vote for him in November.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Kaylee. While you're still with us, are we going to see Donald Trump every day? Will the court make that provision? Does he have to do that on the sidewalk, or do we get the lobby news conference? Is this something that will be a game day call?
Well, he could talk to press in the hallway coming in and out of court. He could also speak to the press and have spontaneous kind of news briefings at Trump Tower. All of this is in play, and frankly, he's going to need to do that if he wants to continue to be able to quasi-campaign while he is mandated to be in this courtroom 4 work days a week. Every day except Wednesday, he will have to be here in Manhattan. So it limits his time. It also, of course, limits his resources, as he is spending millions of dollars on his legal defense, money that therefore isn't being spent actively on campaigning. And of course, the other political consideration here, Joe, which you and I know well, is that Bloomberg's polling done together with Morning Consult suggests in the 7 key swing states likely to decide this election, more than half of voters say they would not vote for Trump if he is convicted of a crime. Of course, we'll find out approximately 6 to 8 weeks from now if he's convicted of any of these felonies here in New York.
All right, Kaylee Lyons, great to see you. Kaylee, thanks for being in New York for us, and we'll connect with Kaylee a little bit later in the broadcast as the process actually gets underway. We wanted to lay down a marker and be there for it in person. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we turn to the other major story unfolding here, and of course, that's what happened over the weekend in the Middle East as Iran unleashes an attack of hundreds of missiles and rockets directly against Israel. Not miraculously, and through remarkable technology and coordination, Israel, working with the U.S., the U.K., France, and Jordan, managed to knock down 99% of them. The headline on the terminal, Iran's attack on Israel sparks race to avert a full-blown war, as the world now waits to see what Israel will do. We spoke earlier with John Kirby, spokesman for the national security apparatus at the White House earlier today. He was on Bloomberg surveillance. Here he is.
The president was very direct that this was a huge success, that Israel can be proud that it doesn't stand alone and that it has superior military capability. Iran utterly failed in what they were trying to achieve, and that success alone sends a strong message to Iran and to the region about Israel's place there.
Iran utterly failed, he says. A resounding success. So if the attacker doesn't manage to lay a glove on you, do you still punch back? That's where we start our conversation with Alex Vatanka. He's the Middle East Institute's director of the Iran program. And Alex, it's great to have you with us. on this day. Your voice is important to us as we try to figure out the next move. Does the White House have the right posture when it comes to dealing with Israel? Does Joe Biden have any leverage in helping to determine this outcome?
First, great to be with you. Look, in terms of the messaging from the White House, I think it's very clear the U.S., this administration is not interested in that regional conflict broadening or dragging the United States into it. We all can appreciate why that is, and that's the administration's position. I know there'll be some criticism whether the Biden administration stood behind Israel the way it should or not. And I think the challenge for the Biden administration is to convince the Israeli government, and that has been a challenge for successive American administrations in the last few years, to convince Israel that they're better off hand in hand with the United States than going at Iran alone. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me. You just heard that U.S. certainly thinks this was a strategic win for Israel and a strategic defeat for Iran. And you could make that case strongly. And if that's the case, then what's the rush? Why not wait before you retaliate against this Iranian strike on Israel?
Well, there you are. Just imagine a world, though, in which some of those rockets and missiles got through. It would have meant likely the deaths of hundreds of Israelis. So I understand the idea that a response of some sort is called for here, if only as a deterrent to keep Iran from doing it again. Is it possible, Alex, for Israel to respond without losing the alliance that it has created?
Look, the quick answer to that, the latter part of what you just said, is that Iran basically was alone here. I mean, if you even look at the Arab countries, there was not much support, if any. I mean, there might have been, I'm sure there was some support on a sort of street level in the Arab world. But Iran, this non-Arab country that has tried to use Palestine to make itself into the leader of the Islamic world, essentially failed. And in some cases, as with the Jordanians, they were actively involved in stopping this Iranian attack on Israel, and others probably were involved. We just saw from the Wall Street Journal that UAE and Saudi Arabia also played a role. So I think so much of what happens now going forward is whether Israel can turn around and use what happened over the weekend into strategic leverage against Iran. Basically to say, look, Israel is here to stay. Israel should, however, saying that, find ways to coexist with Arab countries that do want to accept it, most notably Saudi Arabia. And again, that takes us to the issue of the Palestinians. If Israel tomorrow could somehow solve, and I know I'm saying something that's much easier said than done, but if just say Israel could somehow find a path to a solution to the Palestinian problem, then Iran's axis of resistance, its proxy network, none of that makes no sense going forward. And by the way, one thing we have to remember, the Iranian population is the most upset about what the regime in Tehran is doing in terms of its regional agenda. And there is no support for what Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards are doing against the state of Israel.
Consistent with what we've frequently seen from the Iranian people. So then is the calculation correct, Alex, that Iran does not want a wider war, that it is not interested in a conflict that involves the U.S.?
You know, this is the basic bottom line for the Iranian regime. They don't feel if they get into a conflict with Israel, then that's the end of it. They feel that a conflict with Israel means a conflict with the United States. And in many ways, they're right in thinking that. And that is their position. And they don't dare. You know, you can put another 1,000 sanctions on the Islamic Republic. They wouldn't blink. But you start seriously talking about the use of the United States military against Iran, that's when they're going to really seriously back away. That's the track record of the Islamic Republic. But here's the big test for Israel going forward. I talk about strategic leverage. They need to make the argument that, yes, they have problems in terms of what's going on in Gaza, but end of the day, if you believe in the Middle East, where the focus will be on economic development, economic integration, then nation states need to come around the table and have a honest conversation about the future. And Iran's axis of resistance, the use of proxies, non-state actors, that is the opposite of economic development, economic integration, and prosperity for the region. And that Israel needs to bring as many Arab countries, others in the region, and international community to that argument, convince them. And I think if you do that, then the Iranian regime, and again, reminding ourselves, they don't even have their own people behind them, then they will have a very tough position to argue for.
We're spending time with Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. I'd love to know, Alex, to the extent this attack was so carefully choreographed and telegraphed. Iran gave Israel a week's notice on this happening, and then they had something like 5 hours to prepare after the drones were launched on the way to Israel. And of course, they knew the United States. Our CENTCOM commander was in Israel, working with the Israelis to prepare for this. Did Iran know that the defense would be so capable that it was willing to attack Israel directly?
Right. So, I mean, just in terms of context, I'm sure you've covered this already plenty of times, but this Iranian retaliation, in terms of how they justified it, was they said Israel hit them on the 1st of April, their Damascus consulate, and they had to retaliate. They had to recreate deterrence that Israel had, to pay a price. But I will say that the way they went about it, as you just pointed out rightly, to sort of take away the element of surprise, to give the other side plenty of time to prepare, you have to question what they were thinking. And this is what I think happened. They wanted to strike some military sites in Israel. I really don't think they intended to kill civilians, because they knew that would have been too much for anybody to bear, and they would have entered the phase of no return. But they did want to sort of strike the Israelis in terms of their military capacity, and they hit that Air Force base in the Gulf, apparently with some minor damage done to it. But what I think surprised them is how incapable they were. When 99% of your projectiles are intercepted, you're not in a good place. So I think they were surprised that they were so unable to sort of strike some of those sites they wanted to hit. But essentially, I don't think they ever meant to go on and bring about mass casualty in Israel, because they said the consequences would have been that grave.
Well, that says a lot. And I don't know to the extent that the U.S. believed that it could block that much hardware. But we certainly learned something over the weekend. Alex, I only have a minute left. What's your gut? Do you believe Israel responds?
I think the Israelis are wiser than that. I think they recognize what Iran did here is really sort of put itself on the stage as this spoiler, as this mother of all spoilers. A country that really, even if it wants to fight for the Palestinian cause, there are much better ways to go about it. That this is a revolutionary militant state that has lost its own people. And really, if you recognize that as a starting point, I think perhaps going forward, policies towards Iran, this regime, I should say, could be better, could change, and hopefully get better results.
Alex, I'm really glad you could talk to us today. I appreciate your time and your insights as we have a chance to tap the experience of Alex Vatanka. He's director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. We'll have voices of experience throughout the program today as we try to unpack what happened last weekend and get a sense of where we're going forward, with an eye on a courthouse in New York, the Trump trial, the hush money case getting underway today as well. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Glad you came along on this Monday. Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.
12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow and the S&P both advancing. NASDAQ now in the red. Little changed on the NASDAQ Composite Index, down 7 points, but a loss nonetheless. We've got the S&P up 10. That is a gain right now of 0.2%. Dow Industrials up 132 for the Dow, an advance right now of just about 0.4%. 10-year at 4.63% with a 2-year, 4.94%. Gold up $4 the ounce to $23.48, up 0.2%. The 10-year's yielding 4.63% with a 2-year right now 4.94%. West Texas Intermediate crude pulling back today, down 1.4%. WTI now at 84.45 a barrel for oil. Treasuries sold off as solid retail sales spurred bets that the Federal Reserve will be in no rush to cut rates. Traders also getting ready for a flurry of bank debt sales. Elon Musk says Tesla will be slashing global headcount by more than 10% as the car maker grapples with a slowdown in electric vehicle demand. Tesla shares lower now by 3.3%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. NASDAQ is lower. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 0.1%. S&P up 6, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Good to have you with us on the Patriots Day edition of Balance of Power. Happy Marathon Monday. It was quite a weekend and a remarkable story to tell for the administration and certainly for the Pentagon. We did learn yesterday that President Biden made phone calls to the 2 F-15 fighter squadrons that were involved the night before. American fighter pilots literally shooting down missiles fired by Iran toward Israel, something that we thought maybe we would never see. And if we did, most assumed it would be the prelude to a much wider war. But we sit here on a Monday in Washington with questions about how and if Israel will respond. This was a concerted military effort, though, not just with Israel. It involved the U.S., as I mentioned, as well as the U.K., France, Jordan. We're learning more parties were involved, and we wanted to spend some time with Tony Capaccio, Bloomberg's Pentagon reporter, who's a regular voice on this program and has a sense of the hardware and the strategies involved here. Tony, it's great to see you.
Thank you.
I'm guessing your phone was blowing up all weekend here. We threw a lot of hardware in the air on Saturday night. To what extent, just as we understand it, was the United States conducting this versus Israel itself, conducting and executing these defense maneuvers?
We were in coordination with them. We were not unilateral. The F-15's E squadrons then went up. Were under the joint command of the U.S. and Israel, part of their network air defense system.
I see.
So envision this as a 2024 version of the Battle of Britain in the opening days, where instead of the Luftwaffe coming in, you had Shahed 31 drones, winged drones. They're mini airplanes.
Yes, right.
Versus instead of Spitfires, F-15Es, F-15Is, and I think the Joint Strike Fighter. And this has all happened at night, so it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But the video they showed, the Israelis have shown, it looks like were you taken down with air-to-air missiles. The F-15E can fire 8 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles. They've got a backseat operator who's the weapons guy. He doesn't drive the plane. They got a pilot and a weapons guy. So that's the minuet in the air. But
fascinating.
Like a mini Battle of Britain, the first opening day.
It's incredible the way you just illustrated that. And the F-15, of course, is an airframe that goes back to the 1970s, but this is a much more up-to-date version. We need these old jets still to do these jobs.
This isn't really old. The F-15E is like one of the top non-stealthy bomb carrier of the United States.
The platform's old, though, right? I mean, we've kept these things updated remarkably well.
Somewhat old, but it's got great electronics. This is a really key. I flew a familiarization flight on one of these in the backseat a number of years ago.
Yes.
So it's a premier fighter. If it was the F-35, they carry less armament, actually. But I can see why they would have used this airplane. You've got the backseat weapons operator kind of searching for targets and firing while the pilot's driving and monitoring the overall situation.
Did they know they could do this?
Oh, yes.
To such an extent of success.
This stuff is gamed in simulations.
Yeah.
So the Israelis and the U.S. had an exercise last year called Juniper Oak. All your readers should do a Google of Juniper Oak.
I'm ready now.
Because that was a huge, the biggest war game ever between the U.S. and Israel. That was like January, start of last year. And that set the stage for a lot of the command and control and coordination that played out over the weekend.
Fascinating. I'm going to throw another war game at you. Chariots of Fire. You remember when Israel gamed out its potential military options in attacking Iran's nuclear infrastructure? That's the extreme scenario that the administration is worried about here.
Yeah,
correct?
the problem with that is if they did that, you got DIA and other U.S. intelligence analysts are saying Iran is not moving toward building a bomb.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Israel's got the capability, the deep bunker buster, massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster capability that only the B-2 bomber can carry to hit those deeply buried targets. So if there's going to be retaliation, I'm thinking it may be a combination of cyber and using the the F-35 to surgically knock out buildings like they apparently did in Damascus, the attack that precipitated all this retaliation.
And that would be considered a more measured approach? That would be kind of the middle ground that the Pentagon's looking at?
I don't know if they're looking at.
They must be gaming.
They're gaming it, but that would be measured. It would show Iran, hey, we can knock your door down at night, and you're not going to know that we're coming on knocking.
Fascinating. As I mentioned, we threw a lot of hardware in the air. Do we have a sense of how much was used, what needs to be replaced? The Iron Dome was very busy that night, and we've got a bill on Capitol Hill that would help them to replenish that.
Yeah, this is interesting. They didn't mention the Iron Dome in any of the intercepts last night. They talked about the Arrow 3 and 2.
Is it possible it was not used?
Oh, it's possible. No, I think it was used in for these short-range Katyushas that were fired from Gaza as part of the attack, and possibly from Lebanon. I'm sure they were used to some extent, but these are mostly mid-range ballistic missiles that were fired. So the Arrow 2 and 3, their version of Patriot, were used. I don't know how many they were used, but if there were like 100 and they fired 2 per missile, the U.S. would help pay for the replenishment of those. On the Hill, there's a $14 billion supplemental, including there's $60 billion Ukraine supplemental. Well, there's this $14 billion supplemental for Israel that's got money for like some 10,000 Iron Dome interceptors called the Tamer, and to buy 10 more Iron Dome launchers. So Ukraine may benefit from this in terms of Congress moving to push the whole package because of the attacks.
We're waiting to find out if it moves as one big piece of legislation or if they cut them up. But you're describing the bill that it's actually already passed the Senate.
Correct.
And you're right. Everyone obsesses over the Ukraine money. There's $14 billion for Israel in there. That would be the most significant part of that money would be to replenish those air defenses.
That's my sense,
right? Yeah. It could see a vote as soon as this week. The contractors who stand to benefit, all familiar names?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. The Boeing has a multi-billion-dollar, forgive me, I don't know the exact number.
Yeah.
It's for a follow-on order of F-15EX airplanes. I think it's 50. They put this order in a number of years ago, and the State Department in January informed the Senate that this was an informal notification that we're going ahead with. It's been caught up in the whole reaction to the Gaza situation and the horrific.
This is separate from the supplemental.
It's separate from the supplemental, but it's being viewed negatively by a number of members in the House and some in the Senate. But I think this has a good chance of going through now as part of an overall, we need to support Israel situation.
How about that? Maybe you could be attached to something this week. But these are the same jets that were used on Saturday night, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, they would be the same jets for Israel, right? It's not attached to anything.
I wonder if they do attach it, is what I'm saying.
The procedure in 5 seconds is this. The Senate and House Foreign Relations Committee's chairman and minorities have to nod that they're okay with it, and then the State Department will formally notify, starting a 30-day clock.
I see. In the meantime, this other bill could be done by then. We'll have to wait and find out. Obviously, on that, I haven't even mentioned Ukraine and what's inside there, which is probably a conversation for another day, as this is apparently imminent on the House floor.
Yeah.
But Tony, is the Pentagon talking with Israel in the aftermath of all of this? Is it a political conversation now, or is the military conversation continuing? We knew the leader of CENTCOM was there, for instance, last week.
I think the military conversation is continuing in terms of what do we need to improve your layered air defense, what replenishments needed. Did we learn anything from the slow-moving massive drones to calibrate a better response, a better response next time. Although this was pretty successful. One thing I think played out though: U.S. intelligence satellites helping feed Israel knowledge of what was going on in the air, and also the fact that the Biden administration kept saying the attack was imminent.
Yes, right.
Remember in late 21 when they said Russia was close to attacking Ukraine? This is messaging to the Russians that we can read your mail.
Yeah,
this is messaging to Iran that we can read your mail.
And then Iran was happy to let us read their mail. It seemed like this was really telegraphed, choreographed in a way that we could maybe intercept the ball.
That's for sure. I mean, this figure, radar screen full of blips of these slow-moving. These are not drones like the little switchblades. These are like mini airplanes.
Yes, right.
Mini.
They had hours to follow.
Hours. So you can watch them in the air. So that was part of Iran's messaging too. I don't know. They might have figured most would be shot down, but the whole buzz being created by this moving swarm toward Israel might have been seen as a demonstration of Iran's power.
Yeah, right.
Even if most of them were shot down.
Didn't have a chance of getting through, apparently.
Well, they might have,
as
though.
we've learned.
But the technology worked well.
It sure did. I can't imagine some of the briefings you're going to be in the next couple of days. It's great to have you with us here the Monday after.
Thank you.
Tony Capaccio, as always, with great reporting here on the terminal and online. Look for his work as our eyes and ears at the Pentagon, and a great help to us here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Our panel is with us today, both Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. We're going to talk to them coming up next after we check world and national news. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons, who's with us in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. History is being made today in New York City, where Donald Trump has become the first former president to face a criminal trial. Proceedings are underway in the case that involves alleged hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 election. Prosecutors say the payments amount to election interference since they were made a month before the election to keep Daniels from going public about an alleged sexual encounter. Trump spoke ahead of today's proceedings.
This is political persecution. This is a persecution like never before. Nobody's ever seen anything like it.
The case was brought by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. His star witness is former Trump attorney and fixer Michael Cohen, who says he personally paid Stormy Daniels to keep quiet. Iran says it considers its attack against Israel concluded. President Biden says the U.S. is still committed to Israel's security. We asked White House National Security spokesman John Kirby what message President Biden has conveyed to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Iran utterly failed in what they were trying to achieve, and that success alone sends a strong message to Iran and to the region about Israel's place there.
White House National Security spokesman John Kirby says there is little damage reported in Israel from the attack. The FBI is conducting a criminal investigation into the deadly collapse of Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge. Those familiar with the matter tell Bloomberg the probe is focusing on the circumstances leading up to the collision and whether all federal laws were followed. Cisse Lema of Ethiopia is the winner of this year's Boston Marathon, finishing in an unofficial time of 2 hours, 6 minutes, 17 seconds. Helen Obiri of Kenya repeats as the women's Boston Marathon champion. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average holding on to gains up less than 0.1%. But since our last update, the S&P now in the red, giving up an almost 1% gain. The S&P down 7 now, lower by 0.1%. NASDAQ in the red as well, lower by 74 points for the NASDAQ Composite Index. That is a drop now of about 0.4%. 10-year at 4.62% with a 2-year right now, 4.93%. We've got spot gold up $6.50 the ounce to $23.50. That is a gain of 0.2%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 1.3%, $84.55 a barrel on WTI. Stocks fell, bond yields climbed after solid retail sales numbers this morning spurred bets that the Fed will be in no rush to cut interest rates. Federal Reserve Bank of New York President John Williams says the central bank will likely start lowering rates this year if inflation continues to gradually come down. He was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Radio.
I don't see it as a turning point. I think that, we saw inflation come down maybe quicker than we expected last year. We definitely saw really lower readings in inflation in the final 6 months. That I never thought that was going to stay that low. That was kind of unusually low. We're now seeing some a little bit unusually high readings. Overall, I think the picture is one of the economy is getting in better balance.
John Williams was interviewed this morning by our Michael McKee here on Bloomberg Radio. Goldman Sachs' back-to-basics approach is paying off as it posted profits that vaulted past expectations. Goldman, after earnings, up 3.2%. Morgan Stanley reports tomorrow up 1.5%. Shares of Charles Schwab today advancing after earnings, up now by 3.4%. Again, recapping, we're looking at a mixed market here with the Dow Jones Industrial Average higher. S&P, NASDAQ, they're both lower. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is the Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues now. And once again, here he is, your host, Joe Matthew.
Right, Charlie Pellet, thank you and welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. We've already covered a good deal of ground here, starting at the courthouse in New York. And Kaylee Lyons will join us again from outside the courthouse coming up at the top of the hour. Unprecedented is the word you keep hearing, appropriately in that case, and with what happened over the weekend, the attack by Iran against Israel, one that has left us wondering here in the Capitol today what will come next. As we assemble our panel, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, as we pick through each of our top stories here. It's great to see both of you. Jeannie, welcome back. Donald Trump is going to be sleeping at Trump Tower, it seems, going to be living there for the next 6 weeks at least. He is actually required to be in the courtroom for this trial. He spoke briefly earlier today, and it is widely expected that he's going to use this as a staging ground, essentially, not just the courthouse, but the neighborhood, if you will, to deliver his campaign messaging for the next 2 months or so. At what point does this become corrosive for his campaign, or is it all up from here?
I don't think we know quite yet. It worked for him during the primary, but of course he wasn't on trial, as he will be for the next 6 to 8 weeks or however long this takes. And he certainly, if he's convicted, that could change the game as well. So I don't think we know yet. I'm a bit nervous about this one. We saw the New York Times Siena poll just in the last few days. Only a quarter of Americans paying attention to this. So, and many say that they would be inclined not to support him if he was convicted, but I'm not sure I even trusted that as well. So much of this up in the air because, as you said at the top, this is unprecedented.
Well, it sure is, Rick Davis. What's your thought as this trial gets underway? We spent months trying to figure out if any of these might take place before the election, and this one now has officially begun.
Yeah, this is, as everybody's been talking about, a historic moment. We should all pay attention because this has never happened in the history of America, a former president being tried on criminal charges. This is a solemn event because we would have always hoped that no president would ever be tried on criminal charges. So it's not a good moment for American history, certainly American political history. But we have to also remember that he's running for president at a time when he and the current president, Joe Biden, are two of the most unpopular political figures in America. So we talk about these things affecting them, and we have to remember that they are already terribly affected by their past performance. Biden, who lost a lot of his popularity at the time he withdrew troops from Afghanistan in a disastrous retreat, and Donald Trump, who's been chipping away at his favorables for nearly a decade now, and neither one of them would be considered popular people today. One of them will be president of the United States. And so this trial has got all the makings of something that, would be a circus at any other time if it weren't so important to our country's future.
You've talked before, Rick, about how difficult it would be to manage a campaign for president when your candidate is trapped 4 days a week in a courtroom, and that is what it will be. 4 days a week at the defense table instead of campaigning, and he'll be spending the night at Trump Tower. How do you work around that?
Yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. And if everybody has a consideration for the managers of the Trump campaign down in Mar-a-Lago, they have to really think through, like, this is all new territory also. Who has ever run a campaign for president where your candidate was sitting in a courtroom for large portions of the year? And he's already spent an enormous amount of time in courtrooms. They've done what they could. They've made it a part of the campaign. This, Donald Trump believes, is nothing more than another rally, another campaign stop, another press conference. And he's using it effectively in his own talking points. He's talking not about being on trial, but America being on trial. And he's there doing this for you, the American people. So they've got their own ability to manage the message around it, but you can't fundraise while you're sitting in a courthouse. You can't go out there and talk about issues people care about. You're talking about your own legal vulnerability. And the question is, because nobody really has a good answer to it, every pollster I talk to just scratches their head and say, we're polling it, we don't know, is at what point does this actually turn against the president and start to whittle away at what little popularity he has left?
That remains a massive question. Jeannie, considering jury selection, that is the process that will begin today with 42 questions, and apparently they're looking for you. They're trying to keep Jeannie Shanzano off this panel, not only because of your politics, but maybe your gender, Jeannie. This is fascinating. In the New York Times, Trump's jury consultants will use demographics to hone in on potential fans to try to get the most favorable jury. They are hoping to spot sympathizers focusing on younger black men and white working class men. Explain the reason for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're looking at the same polls we are. And, it is a difficult task for Trump's defense team because 85% of New York City supported Joe Biden in 2020. And so this is a jury pool that doesn't work to their advantage, certainly politically. And so they hire these consultants and they go through and try to use the data they're getting and their best bets. And so they're going to look at these same polls that we see and say, we enjoy support from young men in particular. Let's try to get those. It's a dangerous game to play, though, because, of course, it is stereotyping. It's gender, it's racial stereotyping. And you don't know by looking at somebody whether they are conservative or liberal or anywhere in between based on just simply their skin color, gender, religion, or anything else. So it's a dangerous game, but it's a game they're going to play as they try to seat the best jury. They're looking for that one who will ensure that Donald Trump is acquitted.
Well, it seems like a painful game. The 42 questions, which have subparts, focus on their neighborhood, ask them about their education level, marital status, who they work for, their hobbies, which news sources they consume. And of course, as we mentioned already, what social media sites do you have an account on the Truth Social? So, Jeannie, the one thing they're not going to ask is whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or whether you support Donald Trump, but that is actually what they're asking in all of these other questions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, any Bloomberg viewer would be perfectly objective and able to go on. They're looking for you know, some of the other outlets who they say are conservative or liberal. But, you know, I think that's the question many people have asked is why not just ask if you voted for Trump or not, if you voted for Biden or not. But the fact is that's a difficult way for the judge to go because you have so many people that voted, you're going to remove almost everybody from your potential jury pool. So they're trying to figure out other ways to get at that information and to try to secure these 12 people and these alternates who are going to be in there. And so it is going to be a tough task. I know they're saying this could take a week or two. I think it could potentially take longer.
Well, for good reason. My goodness, just imagine Rick Davis trying to manage this campaign with a candidate in a courtroom 4 days a week, and it could be 8 weeks we're talking about. My God, I haven't even asked you about debates yet, but we'll get there as our panel sticks with us into hour 2. You know who's with us in New York right now is June Grosso. As we consider what's going on in the courthouse, Bloomberg Law is all over this. And of course, June Grosso is the host, and it's go time. It's Christmas morning for Bloomberg Law. This is unprecedented is the word of the day. June Grosso, a little perspective here because you know what this is like. You're going to see Kaylee on the screen in a minute. You see people in front of the courthouse, and it looks like, oh, we've been through this a bunch of times already. People remember the arraignments and going down to Miami. And, you know, the president, the former president in a courtroom is not really news at this point. But today, there is historical import.
Absolutely. You know, I don't have to say it, but the first time that a president has been on trial in a criminal case, and, you know, it's considered the weakest of the criminal cases against him, but it is the case that is, and perhaps, and maybe the only case that will go to trial before the elections, the way the other cases are bogged down either in legalities or judges who are reluctant to pull the trigger. So I think that, you know, we can't overestimate how important this is. To be seen as impartial, to be seen as not what Donald Trump has claimed it is, which is it's all political, it's a witch hunt. You know, the Democrats are out to get him, and that's why he's in court.
After what we just discussed with Rick and Jeannie, how long do you think jury selection will take? And they get this done in the allotted time?
I mean, let's first face the fact that here we are. What time is it? And they haven't started really jury selection yet. Right. They've been dealing with motions. And you know that it's not like federal court where the judge asks the questions, and so they can move that along in federal court very quickly. Here, both sides get to ask the questions of the, so it might drag on past 2 weeks, but I mean, it depends on the judge. Is the judge going to move it along as quickly as he can? And this is a really good judge. He's known for being impartial, businesslike in the courtroom. You're not going to see any flare-ups of any kind or any kind of sort of fun things like we saw with Judge Engoron in the civil trial, you know, where he allowed Trump a lot of leeway. This judge has already said he's not going to do that, and he told Trump pre-trial that he would jail him if need be, or that he would prevent him from being in the courtroom. And you know, the defendant is supposed to be in the courtroom every day in a criminal trial, but a judge can make an exception if that defendant is acting out or causing a disruption in the case. And the judge warned Trump that that would happen if he did that. So we'll see.
We heard from Donald Trump on Friday. He was actually down at Mar-a-Lago talking about this prospect of jury selection. Let's listen to what he said. Here he is.
Well, you know, jury selection is largely luck. It depends who you get. It's very unfair that I'm having a trial there. It's very unfair that we have this judge who hates Trump and has tremendous conflict, as you know.
Jury selection, he says, has a lot to do with luck. Does this whole 6 to 8 week time frame make sense anymore? Are we going to be talking about this 3 months from now, June?
Oh, well, I don't think we'll be talking about it 3 months from now. I mean, I think there will be some delays, but I don't think it's going to be that kind of a delay. And as I said, this judge is no nonsense, and so I think that he can move it along. I mean, there is a certain amount of luck here because, you know, as Trump says, this is a jury pool that's not in his favor, if you'll have it. In Manhattan County, I think it was 11 or 12% of the vote went for Trump. He wanted it to be in Staten Island. But that doesn't mean that he can't get a fair jury. It may take a little more time, but he can get a fair jury, and that is just jurors who will say that they will make their decision based solely on what they hear in the courtroom, based solely on the evidence before them. I think what both sides have to watch out for here, and the judge as well, as so-called stealth jurors, and those are people who might, shall we say, lie in their jury questionnaires or when they're questioned by the judge or the attorneys because they want to get on the jury for one reason or another, either because they want to rule against Trump or want to rule for Trump, and you have to watch out for those kinds of jurors. That may be the biggest sort of challenge here, but I think getting fair jurors will be otherwise, tough but doable. It always is.
Here's what I want everyone to know. This is really important because right when you're driving home in the evening, you want to know what the heck happened today. This is kind of perfect. Bloomberg Law, 6 p.m. here on Bloomberg Radio with the great June Grasso. She'll cook all this down for you with what you need to know, and of course, looking ahead to the next day. I think the most important thing I learned today, June, you call a courtroom a part in New York?
Oh,
it's
yes.
a trial part?
New York has
Who knew?
very, very different things. For example, the highest court is not the Supreme Court in New York, it's the Court of Appeals. So there are all kinds of little special things that if you take the New York bar like I did, you have to learn.
Yeah. God love you. Part 59, the 15th floor of the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse is where you can meet June Grasso each evening, 6 p.m. Eastern Time here on the radio. June, thank you. We'll connect with Kaylee at the courthouse coming up. This is Bloomberg.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands, and toured America with them, did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger. But drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that. We'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the fire line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
Profits that vaulted past expectations. The Wall Street giant recorded a 28% jump in net income in the first quarter, even as analysts brace for a drop from a year ago. Goldman Sachs shares today, they are down by higher now by 3.2%. Tomorrow we hear from Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley up 1.3%. So again, recapping here, we've got stocks fluctuating. The Dow right now is higher by 12 points, little change, up less than 0.1%, while the S&P is down 0.2%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, here is your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Great to see you on this Monday. Welcome to the Monday edition, the Patriots Day edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And happy Marathon Monday if you're in the Boston area. This is an important start of the season for so many people, and we're trying to acknowledge the optimism here amid very complicated times on this 15th of April. Happy Tax Day as well. A lot to unpack from over the weekend, and we're going to do that following Iran's attack on Israel, and now, of course, a global debate over what should happen next. We're going to spend some time ahead this hour, as I mentioned, with Congressman Zach Nunn, Republican, joining us live today as part of our conversation here on Balance of Power, with a sense of what might happen in terms of the funding debate. Some very important decisions need to be made later today. What's already underway is the historic trial in New York, the first criminal trial for a former president. And of course, Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines is there for us. She's been outside the courthouse for the balance of the day. Donald Trump has already been through the building. Kaylee, what's going on inside it? I'm curious to know what's happening outside. Is this a carnival in Manhattan or what?
Yeah, Joe, it's been buzzing all morning. There is, of course, a very large media presence here. There are also plenty of protesters, both in support of and against Donald Trump, who have shown out today. And right now, there actually isn't anything happening in the room on the 15th floor where all of this is happening. There is a lunch break until 1:30 p.m. When they return, though, we could see a ruling potentially on the question of whether or not Trump should be held in contempt of court. The prosecution has asked for him to be held in contempt because true social posts he has made related to Michael Cohen, who very likely could be a witness in this case. And there is a gag order in place from the judge that bars Trump from talking about potential witnesses, as well as the judge and his family and others tied to this case as well. So we'll wait for a decision on that. We already have seen a decision on several motions before the jury selection process can begin. That work has not yet begun, Joe, and still they are going to need to sort through hundreds of potential jurors and find 12 jurors and 6 alternates who meet the criteria of being able to be impartial and unbiased in assessing this case, in which, of course, Trump is charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records.
Pretty remarkable. And the president, apparently the former president, Kayleigh, will be, of course, in court 4 days a week. He's got to be, therefore will be sleeping at Trump Tower. Is Manhattan going to be compromised by street closures, by Secret Service? How are they going to manage all of this?
Yeah, Joe, it's definitely a logistical nightmare, frankly, if you're security personnel who, of course, have to work in conjunction with the Secret Service. And there's a lot of gateways that have been closed off, a lot of police presence here on the scene in Lower Manhattan, and that is going to have to continue for the duration of this trial, which could be about 6 to 8 weeks. You're right to point out that Trump is required to be here in person as a criminal defendant. He will have to be here every day but Wednesdays, weekdays I'm speaking of. There will be a few exceptions, though, in the coming weeks. The jury will be excused for half days, or at least the proceedings will end after a half day, 2 days next week for Passover. There also will be a break, entirely days off on April 29th and 30th. And frankly, that could just prolong the process of jury selection. This, frankly, is something that could take weeks. And then after that is when you actually get to the arguments and the testimony and the rest of the trial. And of course, we'll see at the end of it, Joe, if Donald Trump ends up a convicted felon.
If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, we're seeing images from Donald Trump earlier today at the courthouse. Kayleigh, they will give him venue to speak to reporters outdoors or in the lobby. How's that going to work?
Yeah, he has the option to speak to reporters in the hallway should he so choose. He did do so heading in to the proceedings earlier this morning, arguing that this is a political persecution, saying that this is an assault against America, that these charges have should never have been brought in the first place. Many arguments we have heard him make before, and kind of repeating a pattern that we have consistently seen, which is that Trump uses these court appearances as a way to court free media, to have kind of de facto campaign events, speaking not just to his base of supporters, but anyone who could potentially vote for him in November. And we do know that voter opinion of him may very well change depending on the outcome of this case, as voters in swing states, according to Bloomberg's polling with Morning Consult, roughly half of them had said they would not vote for Trump if he were to be convicted of a crime. So certainly a lot is at stake here for the former president, not just politically, but also the fact that he could be facing prison time at the end of this, Joe.
Remarkable. Kayleigh Lines, it's great to have you in New York. Of course, typically my partner here on Balance of Power in Washington. We're straddling 2 cities today and appreciate the coverage from Kayleigh this Monday after, of course, the attack against Israel by Iran. A remarkable weekend that took place. Of course, the attacks overseas, but was very busy here in Washington with the President of the United States returning early from Rehoboth to get in the Situation Room with his advisors and try to manage the situation. And we've been hearing about what the White House is framing as a remarkable success. The fact that some 99% of the hardware thrown by Iran at Israel was blocked by defensive systems, and in some cases, in many cases, in fact, American fighter pilots flying F-15s, shooting down these rockets and missiles air to air. We heard earlier today from John Kirby, spokesman for the National Security Operation at the White House. He spoke with us on Bloomberg Surveillance. Here he is.
I can't speculate about future operations one way or another, or future decisions that we might have to make. The president has been clear. We're going to hold Iran accountable for their destabilizing activities. He's also been clear that we don't want a war with Iran. We're not looking for another war in the Middle East, or to see the conflict that's currently underway in Gaza broadened or deepened across the region. Now, we'll have to see how things unfold over the next coming days here. But we don't want a war with Iran, and everything the president has been doing since the 7th of October has been designed to try to bring the tensions down and to make sure that the United States is best postured to defend our interests there in the region.
John Kirby on a noisy North Lawn at the White House. The question is how to hold Iran accountable and what Israel should do now, what the White House, what congressional leaders have the stomach for. That's where we start our conversation with Congressman Zach Nunn, the Republican from Iowa, is joining us now from Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's great to see you. You served our country for almost 2 decades in the United States Air Force. You've worked as an airborne intelligence officer, and you are still serving in the Air Force Reserve, our audience should know. Do you believe that Israel should respond to Iran?
Joe, Israel is our most important ally in the region. They're one of the strongest democracies, and they are certainly the front line in defending folks right here at home. Now, I've flown combat operations in the Middle East for several decades, and I know exactly the threat that Iran poses, both in arming our most hostile adversaries, Hamas, Hezbollah, and now the Houthi rebels who are firing on U.S. forces. But the reality here is that only the United States and Israel could build this coalition of European partners and Arab partners to stop the onslaught of 300-plus weapons meant to destroy the lives of innocent civilians in Israel. That effectively not only deters them, but it shows a level of strength that Iran will have to compete if they ever want to do this again. It's a dramatic change in tone from Tehran to come after and enter directly into a war against Israel. I hope that this is their last strike, but I know that the United States standing with Israel is our best deterrent to prevent a larger regional conflict.
Well, there seems to be this feel this morning, Congressman, and I'm sure you've heard this, that the fact that none of these missiles or rockets got through, the fact that no one was killed in Israel, should essentially preempt a military response. There are a lot of folks in Israel who feel differently about this, knowing that if some of those missiles had gotten through, we'd be having a very different conversation today. And the fact that Iran was willing to actually go there, should it be a military response with that in mind?
That's a great question. The point here is we were 99% successful this time. And the concern here is going forward, we have got to stop Iran now moving forward. It's one of the reasons I've led in Congress in making sure that we cut off their funding. $80 billion under this current administration is going directly to Tehran that goes to proxy fighters. Equally important, a number of the sanctions that the Biden administration rolled back months ago are now empowering them with more funding that's directly funding this fleet of drones that are being sent not just against Israel, but against other allies in the region. This cascade of missiles, including cruise missiles that are targeting folks everywhere from Tel Aviv to the Golan Heights to right in Jerusalem itself. This is a real threat. The United States has been a military deterrent in the region, but we also have to be a diplomatic and economic powerhouse in holding Iran accountable from selling its ghost fleet of oil all over the world, particularly to China and other places that are also hostile to us, bringing that money back and then directing it. So I want a whole of government defined strategy here. Congress needs to do its part and make sure that it funds the weapon systems that protect Israelis. But equally, the administration has to have a strategic deterrent that's more than just parking, destroyers off the coast of Iran. We have got to stop the way the mullahs and the Ayatollah are controlling this environment.
Well, let's get into this, Congressman. You've said it yourself. The matter of funding is on the front burner in Congress, and there's an important meeting later on today with Speaker Mike Johnson, members of your Republican conference in the House, about how you're going to get to this. There's, of course, an emergency supplemental package that we've talked up and down that's passed the Senate that could come in that form. This could be in several different forms. The Speaker could choose to do all of these one by one. And I wonder your preference. Should it be a $14 billion Israel bill and then come back later to talk about a $60 billion Ukraine bill? Or is it all one vote?
Well, first, I'm very proud of my colleagues in the House moving forward early on this. Being able to get funding for Israel that actually took money that would have otherwise been spent on things like hiring more IRS agents to be able to deliver it. Unfortunately, the Senate chose not to take that up. What we know this morning is that folks went to bed on Saturday night in Israel and woke up to a barrage of missile attacks. Iran needs the funding cut from them, and Israel needs U.S. funding now. We have the ability in Congress to move that forward. Now, there is a conversation about a compendium of supporting our allies here. I have very much supported our allies in this region. But let's be clear about what is the most direct need, and that is the ability to resupply Israel today for the weapon systems that kept it safe. That's Iron Dome, that's the F-16s, that's the air-to-air missiles, as well as their ability for things we don't see behind the scenes, cybersecurity and defense of the area. Most of these weapon systems will be produced right here in the United States. This is a return on investment for both Israel and the American worker.
Well, and of course, the people of Ukraine would probably beg to differ as they see their situation as quite urgent, if not more so, with actual ammunition shortages here. Would you vote for a bill that included both? You mentioned monies going to our defense contractors here in the U.S., and the bulk of that $60 billion for Ukraine would do the same. They're actually running out of ammunition, Congressman. Are you a yes on Ukraine funding?
Yes. So that's exactly why I spoke to both the speaker and the leader to be able to bring both of these items forward. It's a top priority, that along with supporting our allies in Taiwan, as well as border security. All four of these issues are things that we have to address now, and we cannot continue to kick them down the road. The Senate has been just derelict in responding on border security, but there's a direct threat in all four of these areas. It's one of the reasons I've led the ability to help support our allies in Ukraine, not by sending more U.S. tax dollars directly to Kyiv, but by seizing the $300 billion in Russian assets that are right here in Europe and the United States. Help them resupply, provide them those loans that get ammunition directly to the front in Ukraine, support our allies in Israel, but also support the Indo-PACOM theater and stop terrorists coming across the southern border, directly supported by Iranian elements. In the same way that the Middle East has been under attack from these insurgents, we've got to be able to defend our own country on the home front. These four together are not only a good common sense national security solution, they're what money for national security is intended for. And let's begin by doing that conversation today and not waiting any longer.
Well, it sounds a lot like that Senate bill that passed. Congressman, there's a threat hanging over your speaker's head. Marjorie Taylor Greene says you go for Ukraine funding.
Yeah. So the one thing I'll say differently is the Senate bill did nothing for the southern border of the United States. And I am all for
so
helping
you'd like
our
to see a
allies.
different border package. I understand. Slightly
right.
different language
That's
on
right.
the border. What if your boss gets fired on this, Congressman? Do you believe Marjorie Taylor Greene would trigger that motion to vacate if Mike Johnson brings Ukraine to the floor?
So, you know, I had this conversation with Speaker Johnson, and as a veteran of multiple tours in Afghanistan, I handed him two bullets. One was the shot that was taken that ended up saving American lives. The other round was a shot that was not taken that resulted in, U.S. forces coming under greater attack. Whenever we have the opportunity to help our allies, to help defend the country, I told the Speaker, take the shot. I believe firmly that Speaker Johnson is going to do the right thing to protect American citizens. And at the end of the day, if that means jeopardizing his career to do the right thing, I stand 100% behind him.
How about that? Congressman, you're part of something that our audience should know about, and that's the four-country caucus, which helps to connect military veterans who are serving in Congress like yourself from both sides of the aisle to talk about issues like these. Is the four-country caucus in favor of funding Ukraine and Israel?
I went directly to Ukraine on the overnight train to talk with President Zelensky and myself just a few weeks ago. And we heard directly that this is a country that's under siege from elements that are supported not only by Russia, but by other axes of evil that want to do harm. My guys back in Iowa, they recognize this. As farmers, fertilizer prices in Ukraine go up, it impacts folks here at home. So we have a national security strategy that has got to be focused on terminating the threat. At the same time, I don't want to see another forever war. We have got to have vision from this White House on how it's going to defend this country and our allies. And I'm looking forward to working with anybody, Democrat or Republican, who will help move that national security strategy forward.
Zach Nunn, Republican from Iowa. We thank you, Congressman, for joining us, and we'll, of course, keep you posted on the funding debate in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. Another leg lower for the U.S. stock market. Lows of the day right now on the S&P down 25 points. Back below 5,100 at 5,097. The S&P now lower by 0.5%. Keep in mind, at one point this morning, the S&P was up by 1%. Right now, we've got the Dow lower by 84 points, down 0.2%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down 137 now, lower by 0.9%. Stocks dropped amid a slide in a handful of big techs. Bond yields are climbing. The 10-year right now 4.63%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.92%. Spot gold up $13 the ounce to $23.58. That is a gain of 0.6%. A retreat though for crude. West Texas Intermediate backing off, down 84 cents a barrel, 84.82 on WTI, lower now by 1%. Elon Musk says Tesla will slash global headcount by more than 10% as the car maker grapples with a slowdown in electric vehicle demand. Tesla shares, they are trading lower today. Tesla right now down 4.2%. Recapping, stocks lower across the board. S&P lows of the day right now down 27, lower by 0.5%. Balance of power continues now. And back we go to Washington. Once again, here is your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you, and thank you for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, indeed, in Washington. Kaylee Lyons is in New York at the courthouse, as you saw earlier, following day one of Donald Trump's trial. The big question in Washington following the weekend that was is what now? And that goes for both how to handle the situation in the Middle East with regard to a military response, potentially by Israel, one that the White House is trying to prevent or at least contain. And then there's the situation on Capitol Hill. What now, Mr. Speaker? Mike Johnson back from a weekend visit to Mar-a-Lago and a brief conversation on Sunday morning television with some very difficult decisions to make regarding Israel and Ukraine, for that matter. And we assembled our panel to get going on this now. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us, our signature panel. Rick, there's an important meeting right around 5:30 Eastern time today. Speaker Johnson is going to be meeting with members of his conference, having spoken with the leaders of the intelligence committees, those that are related to the subject matter at hand. And he's got a decision to make. Does he put his career on the line and bring Ukraine funding to the floor that's somehow tied to Israel? Or does he just deal with the Israel matter this week alone? None of the leadership have given us a sense of what might get a vote this week. What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, I'm hearing that he did make some progress, evidently, in Mar-a-Lago on getting Trump to back off the anti-Ukraine emphasis. But at the end of the day, you're exactly right. He's got to decide whether he can put a supplemental package that looks something like what the president gave them months ago onto the floor. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is not backing off of her demands that the speaker withdraw that, not present it. And if he does, she potentially could begin to start the process of selecting a new speaker. So you're right. I mean, he's got a decision to make. Doesn't necessarily mean he gets ousted as speaker. We got a lot of Democrats who would like to see that Ukraine piece part of the package of supplemental funding and would be willing to back the speaker in his job vote if that is a net result. But likely they'd want something for that. And those negotiations, from what I'm hearing, have not even begun. So it's a very dicey period of time in the House of Republicans, and at an incredibly important time to the country and to our allies.
To think that we still don't know now is remarkable. Of course, he could move that Senate bill, Jeannie, remembering there's $14 billion for Israel in that bill. Following our conversation just now with Congressman Nunn, I'm thinking maybe not, if they're still, of course, concerned about the border component. And Mike Johnson told Fox News on Sunday morning that Donald Trump was supportive of conditioning Ukraine aid as a loan. It sounds like we're going to get a new bill or several this week, don't you think?
Yeah, I do think they're going to try to go with a new bill. I think all indications from Mike Johnson at this point is they're going to try to fund Israel without Ukraine, so he's able to appease those people on his right And that, of course, itself has its challenges because we remember it was just a few months ago they tried a standalone bill for Israel and that went down.
Yes, right.
And let's not forget, he's got a 2-seat majority today, Monday. And I believe as of Friday, Mike Gallagher leaves early the House and they are down to 1. So this thin majority that he has now is going to make this all that much trickier. I do think Donald Trump's public support of him on Friday is going to help, but of course it still hasn't publicly deterred Marjorie Taylor Greene.
What's your thought on this motion to vacate now that we've had a little bit of time for this to wash around here, Rick? Is Marjorie Taylor Greene really trying to get the speaker fired or trying to determine the outcome of the House agenda to the extent that she can and raise some money while she's at it? Not a lot of people take her seriously on the former.
Yeah, I'd say none of the above. I think it's all performance act on her part. I don't think she's trying to influence an agenda, and I don't think she really cares about Speaker Johnson. I think he's just a means to an end. Just when things were starting to really crater for Mike Johnson, she pulled out this device and campaigned on it, spent a lot of time over the last 2 weeks getting in the news, none of which has resulted in any productive outcomes around any agenda items. So you have to just mark it up to her typical performance requirements. She's got to get the attention. She wants to be looking powerful. And in this case, she really is a lone wolf in the House and a very disruptive force. Even Donald Trump wouldn't back her up when Johnson went back down to Mar-a-Lago, and he's one of her biggest supporters. So in this case, it's a high wire act on her part. It makes Matt Gaetz's initial effort to oust McCarthy look like child's play. She's really drawn this thing out and creating a lot of tension.
Amazing stuff. As we spend time with our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Donald Trump in New York today in a courthouse as his name keeps coming up in this conversation about funding. And there's a new poll out today, Siena College, New York Times. It's one that we follow pretty closely here on Balance of Power. The headline is good for Joe Biden, Jeannie. Biden shrinks Trump's edge in latest Times Siena poll. They're basically tied in this case, 46% to 45%, 1% for Donald Trump. But there was something more interesting in this poll to me. It found a big increase in registered voters, 9%, 9 points. Registered voters who believe that Donald Trump left the country better off. And that's going to be the question that voters consider when they walk into a voting booth. And I wonder your thought on that, because a lot of people have a hard time re-visualizing the world in the midst of a pandemic and a lot of the confusion that surrounded that period of time, where we were 4 years ago. What does a Democrat do with a piece of information like that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think one of the challenges is that Donald Trump has been less in the headlines than Joe Biden, obviously, as the sitting president. But as he begins to consume all the oxygen in the room, people will be reminded of the chaos that is Donald Trump. And that may help in that regard. But I think for me, one of the fascinating things about this poll was they talked to this woman, Beth, from Connecticut, and she said, you know, she's gonna lean towards Biden because he's the lesser of two evils. And they talked about the fact that this is how so many voters feel, that they don't like either one of them, but it's going to be the lesser of two evils. And that's why I think this trial that Donald Trump is just sitting in today or starting today is so important, because people are going to be reminded as to the fact that this is a man on trial for, you know, facing 34 counts, each of which carries a 4-year potential sentence if he's convicted. And if we're talking about 100,000 voters in a few swing states deciding this thing, it can impact some people's views, and that can have a big impact on a very tight election.
I'm just fascinated by the rear view mirror in this case. Rick, you're both polling experts. Donald Trump beats Joe Biden when people are asked how they remember their presidencies. 42% rate Trump's term as mostly good for America, compared to 25% for Joe Biden. What does the headline number count for when you have lines like this?
Yeah, it's a complexity for Biden. He has to sell the future, and he's in the middle of a morass. I mean, this is where incumbency doesn't really do you any favors. There are a lot of positives about incumbency when you're running for president, but this is the state of American economy today. Still, the vast majority of voters are voting on the economy. They are hit by inflation. That is something that is going to perplex this administration probably through the election. They've got to get used to it. And in that regard, it's very easy to say, it just seemed better before. This is the classic Ronald Reagan line, where you're better off today than you were 4 years ago. And the reality is, what Biden, I think, really needs to focus on is making sure that he's got a vision for the next 4 years, right? Because this is one thing that Donald Trump can't give, is a picture of the future that's anything other than sort of what Jeannie was saying, a crisis unfolding every day from the Oval Office. And so if Biden could come up with a plan that says, here's what the future, the next term of office for Joe Biden's going to look like, he's got a chance to get people to quit thinking about how they feel today and starting to look forward to tomorrow.
Well, it's really interesting, Jeannie. People talk about they're paying too much for cookies and stuff at the store right now. But 4 years ago, you couldn't walk into the store half the time because of COVID, and they weren't making cookies. I don't know. Is it worth redrawing the world in a pandemic if you're the Biden administration?
Yeah, it's very tough to do. So he's got a big challenge on his hands. I do think he is going to have to address head on the fact that so many voters are still feeling this way about inflation. It would be great if you could bring them back and show them what it was like when Trump was president and during COVID and all those things. But you can't talk people up with something. So he's going to have to present, as Rick said, a vision for going forward, what he's achieved and what he's going to do going forward. But the bottom line is these are two very unpopular candidates.
Great conversation with our signature panel. Great to see you both on this Monday. Jeannie Shanzano, Rick Davis, our signature panel. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we turn now to world and national news. For that, Nancy Lyons joins us from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. Proceedings are underway in the alleged hush money trial brought against Donald Trump. It's the first time a former president has faced a criminal trial. Trump spoke outside the courtroom.
It's a case that should have never been brought. It's an assault on America. And that's why I'm very proud to be here. This is an assault on our country.
Trump is accused of falsifying business records at his company to conceal a hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 election. Today, the judge ruled jurors will be able to hear evidence about another alleged affair that Trump had with a former Playboy model. No signals from Israel yet on what action, if any, it plans to take following the weekend assault it endured from Iran. No major damage has been reported. President Biden says the U.S. remains committed to Israel's security.
We're committed to a ceasefire that will bring the hostages home and preventing conflict from spreading beyond what it already has.
Biden spoke during an Oval Office meeting with Iraq's prime minister. Cisse Lema of Ethiopia is the winner of this year's Boston Marathon. Helen Obiri of Kenya repeats as the women's winner. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Steep losses now for the U.S. stock market. S&P drifts below 5,100. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. NASDAQ 100 index trading lower now by 1.5%. For NASDAQ, a drop right now of 1.5% as well. Got to keep in mind that on the S&P have been up as much as 1%. Right now, the S&P 500 index is trading lower by 1%. S&P now down 51 to 5,072. Dow Industrials down 206 for the Dow, a drop right now of 0.5%. Again, the S&P falling lower by 1%. 10-year yield 4.62% with a 2-year right now. The 2-year yield 4.92%. Spot gold is trading higher, now up $25 the ounce to $23.69 for an ounce of the precious metal. It is up by 1.1%. So again, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. Back to work Monday. A lot of earnings to sift through. Goldman Sachs back to basics approach is paying off as it posts profits that vaulted past expectations. Goldman Sachs shares, they are holding on to gains now of 2.8%. Morgan Stanley, which reports tomorrow, up by 1.7%. Again, recapping stocks lower. S&P selling off. Tech's hit hard. S&P down 47, a drop there of 0.9%. Again, that NASDAQ 100 index down 1.5%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Back we go to your host, and here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you. We'll be back with Charlie Pellet a little bit later on this hour to keep you posted, of course, on midday trading. We've always got our eyes on the markets, even as we talk politics here in Washington, and that is what we are doing. I'm Joe Matthew in the nation's capital. Kaylee Lyons, normally at my side at this time, is in New York covering the Trump trial. Manhattan Criminal Court, where jury selection is grinding. Just getting it started has been a task after quite a bit of jostling from both sides here, with a couple of wins for the prosecution. The judge refusing to recuse himself from the case, as Donald Trump had asked. Judge Merchan will continue. He also ruled that Karen McDougal, I know you're familiar with the Stormy Daniels part of this story. This is the other woman who says she had an affair with Donald Trump, and that the National Enquirer was essentially bought off to keep the story from running, can, in fact, testify in this trial. Judge Merchan ruling as well, prosecutors cannot play tapes from the Access Hollywood recordings. So getting to jury selection has been, as I mentioned, a bit of a grind. It will continue and last the better part of 2 weeks, something we wanted to discuss with the case at large with Michael Zeldin, the former federal prosecutor, is with us now, former special counsel to Robert Mueller while at the DOJ. It's great to see you back. Michael, here we are. A lot of folks thought this day would not arrive ever. In some cases, some thought maybe, if so, it would be after the election. But this is it. What does this initial jostling tell you about the nuances of this trial we're about to watch?
Well, what the judge is doing here is making sure before trial, before there's a jury, that there are clear rules about what evidence can and cannot come in. What you want to do in this pre-trial stage is make sure nothing is uncertain that would result in a mistrial. That is, you bring in something that is so prejudicial that it results in a mistrial. So the judge is properly setting the parameters of what the evidence can be, what arguments can be made from it, so that everybody has, if you will, the scorecard by which they're operating. Once that's all clear, once everyone knows who can testify, what they can testify to, who can testify, what documents are not allowed in, then they can begin the process of picking the jury, and hopefully that will take about a week or two, and then the evidence will start coming in.
Michael Cohen, I'm assuming, is going to testify at some point in this trial. This is Donald Trump's former fixer, his former attorney here, and Trump went on the attack against him over the weekend. There are questions about that, whether I should say that violates a gag order. How do you see it, Michael?
Well, I think it did violate the gag order, but in some sense, we're beyond that point. Trump has said repeatedly, everybody is persecuting him. This is an attack against America, and he's standing up for us. He's proud to be here in the courtroom. But once the doors of the courtroom close and the evidence starts coming in, his rants about Michael Cohen and his lack of credibility, I think, are beside the point. It'll have to be a matter of whether or not they can convince a jury that his prior history of untruthfulness is that which merits an acquittal, or whether, as the prosecution hopes, that Cohen, buttressed by the testimony of others from National Enquirer and within the White House, and particularly the Trump records themselves, support the Cohen story that this was a business fraud intended to suppress the story about Stormy Daniels' affair with with then candidate Trump in order to have it not impact the outcome of the election. So there's two battles for narratives here. Cohen is at the center of them, and we'll see who the jury believes.
You mentioned the jurors. This is going to be a painful process, apparently. The 42 questions, as we've discussed on the questionnaire here, about where they live, their education status, marital status, who they work for, their hobbies, just not their political motivations. But there are a lot of subparts to these questions, and many of these could take some time. Donald Trump's jury consultants, according to the New York Times, are hoping to spot sympathizers, as I read here, focusing on younger black men and white working class men. What's behind that strategy, Michael, and will it work?
Well, I think it's rather cynical that they would think that young African-American males would be sympathetic to Trump on the theory that he's going to argue he's been railroaded, and these young African-Americans, know about railroading, so that they will be sympathetic to him. I think that's very cynical, and I think it misses the point of who those prospective jurors are. We know from the polls that those without a college degree, white, more rural than urban voters tend to be his base. There aren't that many rural voters in Manhattan, so he's going with the white and probably non-college educated prospective jurors to think that they will side with him politically. And, we'll see. Each prospective witness, each prospective juror has all sorts of complications, and the lawyers have to sort of sort out what they think will be the best approach to everything, and then make determinations of how to attack each or how to select a juror.
We should let our listeners and viewers know Judge Merchan says he will hear oral arguments on Wednesday, the 24th of April, week from Wednesday, over the Trump gag order potential violation. That's a day before the Supreme Court, Michael, hears oral arguments in the presidential immunity question that is preventing Jack Smith's January 6th trial from getting underway here in Washington. That, of course, could have far-reaching implications even beyond Donald Trump. So what's a more important day in Donald Trump's legal journey? Is it today, the beginning of this criminal trial, or is it, in fact, the arguments that will be heard before the Supreme Court later this month?
Well, I think big picture, the decision by the Supreme Court on the immunity issue has more implications for Trump, because he is arguing immunity precludes or aspects of the Mar-a-Lago case from going forward, and from the essentially entire January 6th case. So were the Supreme Court to rule in his favor, that would be a much bigger win than this case. But he's on trial. He faces years in prison if he is convicted. And so, you've got to pick your poison, and I think they're both pretty bad for him. But I think, Joe, to the answer to your question, if I were given a choice as Donald Trump, which case do I want to prevail on, I'll take the January 6th immunity argument over this one.
Fascinating. 6 to 8 weeks. Lastly, Michael, is that where we're going with here, or does that depend on how protracted this jury selection is?
Well, they say 1 to 2 weeks for jury selection and 4 to 6 for the trial itself. Now, the judges made pretrial rulings sort of narrowing the scope of the evidence and what can be argued for it. And so if stuff comes in, sort of ordinarily without a lot of interruption, I think this trial could take 3 or 4 weeks. And so you could really get a verdict in about 6 weeks' time, or at least it be sent to the jury in 6 weeks' time. And remember, that which is important in a criminal case, which is there must be a unanimous verdict. And so if you have one holdout or two holdouts for either side, that could keep the jury deliberations going on for a very long time. And so I think Trump's hope here is to find a juror who will hang this jury, because if they have to retry it, that might not get done before the election.
Always a fascinating conversation with Michael Zeldin. Of course, we'll continue talking with Michael about it, former federal prosecutor. And great to have you back, Michael Zeldin, on day one of Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where the question is about funding here for not only Israel, but Ukraine following the weekend attack by Iran. And there's a big family meeting that's going to take place a couple hours from now, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be right in the throes of the late edition of Balance of Power when this happens. Speaker Mike Johnson and his Republican conference, in which he will apparently lay out a plan for what's expected to be a vote this week on funding. The question is, what will it look like? Will this be a loan to Ukraine? Will these be standalone bills? And of course, will the speaker be fired for doing anything involving Kyiv and Ukraine? Joining us to talk about it, Jack Fitzpatrick from Bloomberg Government, who's been on Capitol Hill all day today working on this story. Jack, what are we going to learn when this meeting concludes?
Well, we don't know yet. We just spoke this morning to the new chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, who will have a role in putting together the exact language when they need this to be a bill. But he said it's up to the speaker to decide if they take a shot at doing standalone bills separately for Israel, for Ukraine, for the Indo-Pacific, or if they package everything together. They are still deciding not only the packaging, but for when they do somehow vote on Ukraine aid, the question of, is it a grant or a loan? How forgivable is the loan? Does it include a measure to use seized assets of Russian oligarchs? Does it have a measure lifting the ban on liquefied natural gas exports? There are a number of things up in the air, but there is an expectation that there will be a broad plan laid out at 5:30 today.
Mike Johnson was at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend. As you well know, Jack, he says he did speak with Donald Trump about Ukraine and that the former president supports something in the form of a loan. Is that what we expect will happen, as opposed to, say, grabbing that bill that passed the Senate and bringing it to the floor?
Yeah, it seems clear that they're not going to just go with the Senate passed bill. They want the House Republicans want to do something more in line with Trump's recommendations, with what conservatives want. There is danger politically, excuse me, for the speaker doing anything on Ukraine, but the loan measure is something that has been floated a number of times, and you've heard more and more mainstream voices, including Tom Cole, the new appropriations chairman in the House, say there's a lot of support for that. Lindsey Graham was on board talking about it for a while. So they haven't said officially if that's going to be a loan proposal, but that is something that the Trump and Mike Johnson aligned members have continued to bring up.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any sense on timing here, Jack? This is actually going to happen this week, is what we're told, but then you're going to tell me it takes time to write this, to give everyone a chance to read it, and we're going to be bumping into another weekend and another recess. How's this going to play out in terms of the calendar?
You know, it may not take that long. They've been going back and forth so much. They've already seen legislative text on some proposals. Obviously, the Senate, they're not taking up the Senate's bill, but there is a bill there. They've had time to work on the language of different proposals. It's not clear if they're going to abide by the 72-hour rule in the House. They may not even vote under a rule. It might be under suspension. So if they're determined to get something done before they go at the end of the week for a recess, it is possible, because this has been brewing for quite some time now.
Yeah, of course. And how about Marjorie Taylor Greene? Does Mike Johnson get fired for doing any of this week, specifically Ukraine?
The threat is there. It is focused on Ukraine. The last we've heard late last week from Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, he wasn't making promises, but he said he believes there are a number of Democrats who don't want to see the speaker lose his position because of doing the right thing on Ukraine. So there's at least a hint, if not a promise, that Democrats, even if they don't vote for him, they might abstain and not vote and lower the threshold that he needs. So this seems to be much less of a threat than the one that Kevin McCarthy faced, certainly.
So he thinks he may have survived this already. I think this is fascinating. Whether he got cover from Donald Trump over the weekend, I guess, remains to be seen. If you're with us on YouTube or on Bloomberg TV, you can see Jack is on Capitol Hill right now, and we appreciate your eavesdropping for us on everything that's going on here from an undisclosed location on Capitol Hill. Jack Fitzpatrick at Bloomberg Government. Watch his reporting on appropriations. Specifically, Jack is an expert on the funding of federal monies. And when it comes to Israel and Ukraine, he'll probably have the story first. So from me to you, keep that in mind on the terminal and on the website. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we hand the baton to New York. Now it's almost time for Bloomberg Business Week. And of course, that means Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec. How you guys doing? I hope it was a great weekend. It was certainly a wild one in the news. Carol, what do you have coming up today?
It was nonstop over the weekend, and it feels like today. Of course, we're following what's going on in downtown Manhattan concerning former President Donald Trump. And then, of course, Tim, that hot retail sales print.
That and Tesla selling off as well. We got all that and more coming up on Bloomberg Business Week, Joe.
All right, looking forward to it as always. I'm Joe Matthew for my colleague Kaylee Lyons, who'll be continuing her reporting from outside the courthouse in New York. We'll meet you back here later on Balance of Power. Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday, April 15th, tax day. Just a little reminder in case you forgot or didn't file for extension.
I hope you didn't forget.
Probably. I hope you didn't either. Hey, one thing for sure is we are definitely out there shopping in a big way, Tim.
Yeah, we're spending money too. Also easing geopolitical tensions, initially lifting stocks, but look at the sell-off that's happening. The S&P 500 down around 1% right now as we speak, Carol.
Yeah, NASDAQ 100 down about 1.4%, so pretty much at our lows of the session. Probably a big reason why on that hot retail sales report, we've seen U.S. Treasury yields jumping to their new highs for 2024. So we're going to talk about all of that. We're also going to talk about what's happening in downtown Manhattan.
Yeah, Donald Trump's first criminal trial getting underway in Manhattan today. We're going to head downtown in just a moment.
Speaking of going back to the economy, because that is certainly front and center, New York Fed President John Williams talking to our own Michael McKee earlier today, still expecting rate cuts this year. He's going to explain, and then, of course, we're going to kind of pick apart that hot retail U.S. sales report.
Yeah, we'll do that with the Carney Consumer Institute. We got Katie Thomas joining us in just a little bit on that.
All right, and one more thing, Meta wants to bring students as young as 13 into the metaverse. So what could possibly go wrong?
Some parents I talked to not wild about this, Carol.
Right. Yeah. I can probably understand why. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. It's our one more thing. But first up, let's get a check on today's trade and your top business stories. Here is Charlie Bell.
Thank you very much. We are lower across the board. Steep losses right now after earlier gains at one point this morning. The S&P had been up by 1%. Right now, trading lower. We have got the S&P down by 0.9%. The S&P lower now by 50 points. Also falling below 5,100. 5,074 right now on the S&P. Dow Industrials down 194. That is a drop of 0.5%. NASDAQ down 1.5%. The NASDAQ 100 index also lower by 1.5%. 10-year yield right now, 4.63%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.93%. Spot gold up 0.9%, 23.64 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is lower now by 0.7%, 83.87 for a barrel of WTI. After earnings, shares of Goldman Sachs are higher. We've got Goldman up now by about 3%. Salesforce's Mark Benioff is pursuing what would be one of the company's biggest ever deals after fending off activist investors critical of his reliance on acquisitions. Sources tell Bloomberg Benioff is in talks to buy Informatica in a move that would add to Salesforce's data integration and management capabilities. Again, recapping, U.S. stocks lower across the board, giving up earlier gains. The S&P back below 5,100. S&P right now down by 50 points, a drop of just about 1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, that is your update on the markets on this Monday. Let's get to what's happening in downtown Manhattan. Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, of course, first criminal trial starting in Manhattan earlier this morning, with the judge ruling that jurors will be allowed to hear evidence about the former president's alleged extramarital affair with a former Playboy model. We'll get into why that's important.
Well, in downtown Manhattan, outside the New York Supreme Court, is Bloomberg Balance of Power co-host Kaylee Lines. Kaylee, just set the scene for us. You've been there all day. You were there early this morning. Give us an idea of what exactly is going on.
Well, it really is just the beginning of what could be week-long proceedings here, Tim. Of course, this is a case in which the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg has charged Trump with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to hush money payments paid to Stormy Daniels, the porn star, in the lead-up to the 2016 election. They are all up in a courtroom right now, and Trump is sitting at the defense table up on the 15th floor. And what they've been dealing with so far today are really a series of motions, including a motion to recuse the judge, which the judge denied, and several other motions related to what evidence can be presented to the jury. And it is only just now that they are going to begin the process of actual jury selection. 96 potential jurors are on their way up to that 15th floor to begin getting questioned. That jury questionnaire will include things like, do you have a true social account? Have you ever been to a Trump rally? They're going to try their best to find 12 jurors and 6 alternates who can be impartial, unbiased in assessing this case, considering it is a former president that we're dealing with here. And not just that, an active presidential Republican nominee, presumptively. So finding an unbiased jury certainly is going to be tricky work, and it's a process that could take several weeks.
Yeah, that's a really good point in terms of understanding the timeline on this and why it may take a while. Some of the rulings this morning that were heard, and we mentioned in the lead into you, Kaylee, about the former president's alleged extramarital affair with a former Playboy model. Also, there was the Access Hollywood tape. There were a lot of motions. Anything of note that you think we should share with those who are listening and watching right now?
Well, there really were wins for both sides. On the one hand, the judge did rule that he would not block testimony from Karen McDougal, the former Playboy model, in question and questions around that extramarital affair. Then there was also some wins for potentially the defense, including the idea that the Access Hollywood tape, which of course became pretty famous right close up to the 2020 election, the grab her by that tape will not be played, as will the testimony of E. Jean Carroll in the civil case in which Trump was found liable for sexual abuse and, of course, fined over $80 million in damages for E. Jean Carroll. That will not be considered. So kind of the defense and the prosecution maybe each got wins today, and there's going to be more questions for the prosecution going forward, as they have asked the judge to actually hold Trump in contempt of court for violating a gag order that has been put into place. Trump is barred from speaking about potential witnesses, the judge and his family, others related to this case on social media, and yet there has been a number of True Social posts related to Michael Cohen, his former attorney and fixer, that Trump has posted in recent days. The judge says he will hear oral arguments as to whether or not Trump should be held in contempt on April 24th.
Hey, Kaylee, just before we let you go, you mentioned, of course, that he's the presumptive Republican nominee for president, the former president, that is. To what extent does this take him off the campaign trail during what many would argue is a very important time?
Yeah, Tim, this quite literally physically takes him off the campaign trail, as he has to be here in person as a criminal defendant for every day of this trial, which will be every weekday aside from Wednesdays, really limiting his ability to travel around the country, especially to key swing states and actively campaign. It also will limit him financially, as he's spending millions of dollars on his legal defense, those resources not able to go to typical campaign activities. And then, of course, there is this idea that Trump has been using court appearances historically to advocate for himself, to talk to the press, get that free earned media, make his case to his supporters and the American people. There are ways in which this actually could work in Trump's favor. Certainly it has done so consistently throughout the primary campaign, where he was able to galvanize his base of supporters based on the legal troubles he was facing. But it could get more complicated if he actually is convicted of any one of these 34 different charges he's facing, because we have seen polling that Bloomberg has done with Morning Consult in the swing states that ultimately will likely decide the outcome of the election that suggests more than half of voters would not vote for Trump in November if he is convicted of a crime, guys.
Hey, Kaylee, bottom line, way too early to get a feeling of how long this trial is going to take. You said it could take a couple of weeks, potentially, just to even to seat the jury, but no idea on how long this trial might take.
Yeah. The estimate going in, Carol, was 6 to 8 weeks, but considering we're still dealing with a lot of motions that could have been filed before the trial actually beginning, there's really no telling, but it could be ultimately several months.
All right, always appreciate it. Kaylee, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Balance of Power co-host, Kaylee Lyons, down there outside the courthouse in downtown New York City.
Well, as you know, U.S. bonds selling off today as a solid U.S. retail sales report spurred bets that the Fed will be in no rush to cut interest rates, with traders also getting ready for a flurry of bank debt sales. U.S. Treasury sales, Carol, hitting fresh 2024 highs.
All right, and speaking of U.S. interest rates, earlier on Bloomberg's Michael McKee catching up with John Williams, the president of the New York Fed, and got his take on why a Fed rate cut still makes sense this year. Check it out.
Real interest rates now are considerably higher than they were before, because inflation has come down quite a bit. So we will need to start a process at some point to bring interest rates back to more normal levels. And my own view is that that process will likely start this year. But again, it's going to be driven by the data and achieving our goals.
All right, that, of course, is John Williams, president of the New York Fed, speaking earlier with Bloomberg's Mike McKee. For more on the economic and U.S. rates backdrop, which really seems to be driving the trade today. Back with us is Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie here in studio. Michael, good to have you back. The significance of John Williams speaking about real interest rates now considerably higher than they were before because inflation has come down quite a bit, and then him saying that we're going to need to start this process at some point to bring interest rates back to more normal levels. What's the significance of that? Does that make sense in terms of what he's saying?
It does, but I think the question, which is one that the bond market is increasingly asking itself, is, okay, you've tightened policy, you say policy is restrictive, so why isn't the economy slowing down? It's not. Inflation's not behaving. We saw retail sales.
So why
much
cut
stronger.
rates, right?
You're essentially going to be on hold. This is a Fed that's told us time and time again they're data dependent. Now, the bond market, of course, is many a time has extrapolated this to think, okay, there is a recession coming, the recession risk is there, like we saw at the beginning of this year. They priced in more than 6 rate cuts. Bond market today is now pricing in roughly only 40 basis points of easing this year. And we've taken out, September's now lying right on around 24, 25 basis points. You could see a scenario this year, if this economy stays the way it's going, they probably don't cut until December because they won't want to cut just before the election. So this is what the bond market is now
They don't want to
grappling
cut
with.
right after the election?
Well, after the election, it depends really on what the outcome is of that and what are the policies that are going to be pursued by the next president or administration. But I think realistically, the bond market now is beginning. You can see it in the pricing, right? We saw the 2-year make another run towards 5% this morning. Yeah. It's backed off. But again, you're seeing 5-year yields, 10-year yields selling off. They're up by more than 10 basis points.
4.6 on that 10-year.
Exactly. And so now people, it wasn't that long ago when I was talking to people saying, oh, we're going to buy at 450. Now you talk to those same people, 450, 475 is the kind of range now. This is it's been a repricing by the market.
Anyone in this repricing that you're speaking to talking about hitting 5% again on the 10-year?
It's there. You'd have to really see, can we get through 475? If we get through 475,
we're 463 right now.
Another solid piece of data gets you there, I think, because we're beginning to see a really good, strong pattern here of data coming in. Now, this time last year, things all got derailed by the regional bank blow up in March, April. This time, if the data stays strong, heading further towards, say, Memorial Day, and don't forget, too, oil prices. They came off today, and there seems to be some evidence here that people aren't that concerned about the geopolitical risks out there. But oil prices have been ticking up. And again, that's going to feed into headline inflation.
You know, it's interesting. We've spent so much time talking about the strong retail sales report and how the numbers, even the previous numbers, were revised upward. Having said that, consumers picked up their spending in March, but continued to show restraint toward big ticket items. And I don't know, we seem to highlight that in a big way. Do you think that that's significant and maybe says something about consumers? Yeah, they're spending, but they're not necessarily committing large amounts of money to big things.
No, but then if I'm a consumer and I've got money market funds, I'm getting 5% plus. So maybe they've just made a rational decision that for the first time since really 2006,
Do I really
2007,
need that car or dishwasher?
I'm actually getting pretty good income with pretty much no risk. I'm certainly not getting 5% plus from a bank account.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe they're deferring spending for that. I mean, you could make a case, though, if they're not spending big on goods, is it because they already did that during COVID and coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah.
I mean, we have other evidence that shows that particularly boomers are really spending a lot on holidays, travel. So there's plenty of activity going on. It's probably more about the fact that goods price inflation has come off a lot. I think what's really of concern to the bond market now is the service sector inflation. It's not moderating. And again, as anyone who goes out and tries to book a hotel or for the summer, airfares, they're all going up, plus auto insurance, health insurance. These are things that really came through in last week's CPI, and it continues a trend that's been going on for a while.
Do you think any recent comments, not from Fed speakers or members of the Federal Reserve Board, but specifically from Jay Powell, reflect this persistent inflation?
I get the impression when I listen to Jay Powell that he really wants a soft landing and he thinks that they can thread that needle. I've yet to hear him. He kind of pushed back the first 2 months of CPI.
Right.
So tomorrow when he talks, we don't know what he's going to say. It's sort of unscripted Q&A apparently afterwards. I'm going to be really interested to see how he deals with this because 3 times in a row, once you get 3, that's a trend. We all know there's a journalism. 3 times. It's a trend, right? You've got a story, right?
We're talking about 3 inflation prints.
Hotter than expected.
Or data points.
That keep telling us that they really don't have inflation under control. And if you want to understand why the bond market is getting increasingly antsy, are we really in a world where 3% inflation is going to be where it is? Or as an investor told me recently, he said, we operated for years thinking that 2% was the ceiling. Now it looks like 2% is going to be the floor. And we're now wondering whether 3% is really the inflation story for this year. And as a result, that means yields have to be higher. That's why real yields are above 2% and still picking up. And ultimately, the economy's got this resiliency. And it's, again, until the labor market begins to crack, people can get jobs. They're getting, earnings above 4%. That's running ahead of inflation now. That's a solid economy. Now, I think Powell wants that soft landing. He wants to be able to trim rates a couple of times, but we'll have to see, because he's data dependent and he hasn't given us a framework for inflation and how they really feel about cutting.
And you can't not help but think, in terms of macro factors that are out there, as you say, the labor market continues to stay tight. And you do wonder that if there just aren't enough workers for all the stuff that needs to be done, I mean, maybe we are in a different macro environment going forward that supports that idea that inflation is not 2%, right? Or that 2% level doesn't make up. Like, I do think a lot about these macro factors, the shift to green. We've talked about it a million times. There's just things going on in the world that make me think, certainly as an observer, and I think others too, that 2% just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think obviously COVID's played a huge part, because the big difference between, if you look at the global financial crisis, was they didn't do enough fiscal stimulus.
Yeah.
So we relied on central banks to slash rates to zero, and then hopefully magically activity was going to return to normal. It took a long, long time. It also got people thinking, okay, where do I invest to make a decent return? So it was tough for the bond market. Now you got yields in that 4.5%, 5% zip code. That's really good for income. And that's going to help drive the economy here as well, because you've now got people who are now earning income for the very first time in 15, 16 years.
The wealth effect.
And more importantly, if you talk to bond managers who are now seeing big inflows, they're telling you the demand for bonds isn't just coming from ordinary people who want to lock in 5%. It's coming from a lot of those investors who went flocking to private credit.
So
10 years ago.
institutional money.
Institutional money now saying, I can get, with a little bit of leverage through repo, a good 6-7% on treasuries. Why am I going hunting down for private credit and locking my money up for 10 years with private equity?
And no risk.
And Larry Fink talked about this in the earnings call from BlackRock on Friday. So you can feel, as bad as it's been for the bond market, and let's face it, the bond market's down 2.5% and change already this year. There is money wanting to come into these bonds and buy them.
Hey, Michael, we only have 20 seconds left here, but Jay Powell's speaking tomorrow. Apart from that, what's the next catalyst that you're watching for the bond market?
I guess it's going to be the inflation numbers towards the end of this month, and then it's payrolls.
Yeah.
Plus, of course, we have the Fed meeting to come as well. But I think it's going to...
Just a few weeks away.
It's the data. I mean, we're all data dependent here.
Yeah.
And
hey, Tim, did you know we're data dependent?
Michael McKenzie told me that. It was the first time I'd heard it.
We've all been.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding you. Michael McKenzie, great stuff as always. Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie joining us here in studio. Still ahead, we've got the latest trip up for shares of Tesla. Also data dependent in a way. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. The selling, we're near our lows.
5:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We're looking at a tech-led sell-off right now with the S&P 500 index falling below 5,100, very close to the lows of the day right now with the S&P down 54, lower by 1.1% at 5,069. The Dow Industrials are down 220, a decline of 0.6%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is down 261 now. That is a drop of 1.6%. The 10-year, the yield there 4.63% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.94%. Spot gold is up 1% right now. Gold at $23.68 the ounce on spot. We've got West Texas Intermediate crude oil trading lower. Crude now down by just about 0.1% at $85.66 a barrel on WTI. A tech-led sell-off underway. Again, the S&P down by just about 1%. Alcoa shares are higher after both the United States and the United Kingdom imposed new restrictions on trading Russian aluminum, copper, and nickel. Russia remains an important producer, accounting for 6% of global nickel supply, 5% of aluminum, and 4% of copper. Again, Alcoa shares, they are up today on a down day for the rest of the market. Alcoa up now by about 4.5%. So again, recapping, stocks lower. The S&P now down 56, a drop there of 1.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, shares of Tesla trading lower today, down 4.9% on the latest drop of negative news, including a Bloomberg exclusive about two of Tesla's top executives